أهلا وسهلا فيكم ببدوي تريد. معكم نحن مباشر لنقل كلمة جيروم باول اللي الأوركسترا للسوق كله، هو اللي بينظم السوق كله. كلمة واحدة منه لهالشخص بتغير كل شيء. هذا الشخص هون جيروم باول. قدام السنة رح يحكوا معه. هلأ في موعدين له، في اليوم وبكرة. اليوم رح يحكي قدام جمعية مجلس الشيوخ كرمال البنوك والبيوت والوضع العام الاقتصادي العام. بكرة رح يحكي مع جمعية الأمور المالية صراحة. خلينا ننتظر ونشوف شو رح يصير. أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. عامل تشارت للبيتكوين. نحن شفنا هبوط، العالم كلها خيفان ناطرة شو بده يحكي باول. كلمة واحدة منه بتأثر. بدنا ننظر على البيتكوين وبدنا ننظر على الدكسي دولار اندكس. اذا باول كان متشدد بسياسته بدنا نشوف خرق صعودي لقوة الدولار الامريكي. اذا كانت سلبية بنشوف هبوط له وصعود للبيتكوين. هول الامرين اللي رح نراقبهم. لا، ما معي رقمه. صباح الخير جميعا. انا وجه الضوء عندي صراحة هون الساعة 2 وجه الضوء، بس قلت خليني واكبكم شوف شو بده يصير. يلا، شكله رح يبلش. شو يا أحبائي جميعا، انتوا 4 المساء، أنا 2 وجه الضوء. سامي، أنا 2 وجه الضوء عندي. خليفة أخضر، إن شاء الله يكون أخضر. منورين جميعا. صباح النور. هلا رح تحضرها هون أونلاين، رح تحضرها لايف عندي أونلاين سامي. أنا هون عندي إياها لايف حاليا. بتمنى عليكم تعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب للشانل، بكون ممنونكم. هلا أول ما تبلش رح ننقلها هون دغري ونترجمها. أهلا وسهلا بمصر. يلا إن شاء الله يحكي وتكون إيجابية. نحن نضلنا منتظرين الأسواق دقيقة ودقيقة عشان نشوف شو بده يصير. صباح النور خيي، يعطيك العافية. الأردن الساعة 6 العصر، الأردن ومصر نفس الوقت 6 مساء. أليكس كمان واحد معنا من إسرائيل، 2 وجه الضوء. والله صراحة الفكرة أنا برأيي على الأرجح نسبة الزيادات رح تفضل 2 فاصلة. رح يكون بده يقول بده يضله متشدد على فترة أطول. ما بعتقد رح يطلع للخمسة 0.5% زيادة فوائد، بس ما رح يقولها هو. بس الحديث كله رح يقول إنه رح نضلنا بزيادة الفوائد على فترة أطول. هالسنة ما بقى في هبوط للفوائد. هذا اللي برأيي رح يصير. بدنا نشوف نسبة التشدد تبعه. هلا كل هالأمور بدنا ننتظر كمان أرقام التضخم ب 15 شهر، هي اللي بتحدد كل شيء. ولكن هذا الحديث اللي رح يكون أنا برأيي. يلا ما بقى في وقت، ما بقى، قربت. يلا خلينا نركز. هلا بنحكي. بتذكروا انتبهوا كتير من حركة السوق بده ينزل ويطلع بيحرق اللونجز والشورتس قبل ما ينعرف الوجهة تبعه. دايما هيك بيصير وقت يحكي جيروم باول، لأنه بيعرفوا كل الأسواق خيفانة. في عالم بدهم يلعبوا بالفيوتشر، بينزلوا يا لونج يا شورت، بيحترقوا على الميلتين. انتبهوا من هالأمر. أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. البيتكوين ل 18,000 إن شاء الله إن شاء الله. إذا في كتير عالم متمنية ترجع تدخل وتشتري بهالأرقام. الجيريا أهلا والعانة من الجميع. بتمنى هلايكم تعملوا لي لايك وسبسكرايب للشانل، بكون ممنونكم. خلينا نشوف وين صار هيدا. يلا بلشوا حياة بقى. شكله نأخروا دقيقتين. أنا حاططها على إذاعتين قلت بركي. كمان إذا بتعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب بكون ممنونكم. يلا هيك الخوف بالسوق، بس عم ينزل السوق بس كرمال شخص واحد بده يحكي. مش ينهار هلا 100-200 دولار ما.
This hearing will come to order. Welcome, Chair Powell. Thank you for doing your duty and seeming to enjoy it when you come to our committee. Thank you. Seeming to enjoy it. Today, we examine the Fed's actions to combat inflation and whether these actions are actually working, including how those actions affect American jobs and their paychecks. Prices are still too high across many parts of the economy. We know that who feels it the most when the cost of rent and groceries go up? It's not the economic pundits and politicians who lecture us about discipline and stability. It's not the corporate executives who pretend they're making tough choices about prices while reporting record profit increases quarter after quarter and doing more and more stock buybacks. It's the people working hourly jobs to make ends meet. It's seniors with fixed income and Social Security. It's everyone who gets their income from a paycheck each month, not an investment portfolio. It's those same Americans who stand to lose the most if the Fed's actions to curb inflation go too far. No matter what goes wrong in our economy, a global pandemic, a war in Eastern Europe, weather disasters, profits somehow always manage to go up. Workers are left paying the price. As you've noted, Chair Powell, the Fed's tools are only one element in our fight against inflation. It's a complex problem. Interest rates are a single, we know, blunt tool. Raising interest rates can't rebuild our supply chains and fix demand imbalances from the pandemic. Raising interest rates won't end Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. Raising interest rates won't prevent avian flu from devastating 1/3 of our egg supply or weather disasters from destroying key crops.
عم بيقولوا انه زيادة الفوائد ما رح تحل كل مشاكل التضخم، هي احد الامور اللي بتساعد.
To jack up prices far beyond the increase in their costs. Last year, corporate profits hit a record high. Corporate PR chiefs assure us that these companies just have to raise prices. Their costs are going up. The workers just want to be paid too much. They have no other choice, they tell us. Yet when you look at their profits and their executive salaries and their stock buyback plans, it sure doesn't look like corporations have exhausted every available alternative. It's so brazen. Even global bankers called on the Fed to identify this profiteering is one of the biggest drivers of
عم
inflation.
بيقول أحد
Paul
أسباب
Donovan, the chief
التضخم هو
economist of
الشركات عم
Global
بتجرب
Wealth
تربح
Management
أموال
UBS, wrote, the Fed
بغض
should
النظر عن
make
كل شيء
clear
بزيادة أسعارها
that
وكل
raising
الأمور هيدي
profit
بتأثر
margins are spurring
بالتضخم.
inflation.
الحكي
Companies
عن
have
الحرب
passed higher
بأوكرانيا
costs on
حكي
to
عن كثير
consumers,
أمور.
but they've also taken advantage of circumstances to expand profit margins. The broadening of inflation beyond commodity prices is more profit margin expansion than wage cost pressures. Think about that. From a chief economist at UBS, I'll say it again, they've taken advantage. These companies have taken advantage of circumstances to expand profit margins. The broadening of inflation beyond commodity prices is more profit margin expansion than wage cost pressures, unquote.
اوكي طيب اساله
The
سؤال
Fed,
خلي جيروم
understandably, the
مش
Fed
انت.
can't force corporations to change their ways or rewrite the Wall Street business model on its own, but the Fed can talk about it. High interest rates, falling wages, increasing unemployment are all hallmarks of failed policies that end up helping Wall Street, the largest corporations in the country, the wealthiest people in the country. Because let's be clear what we're talking about when people use the economic speak that can cloud this conversation. Cooling the economy means laying off workers. Lowering demand means workers get fewer raises. Of course, there are times when the Fed must act. We can't allow inflation to
عم
become a
بتأثر على
trend.
الشخص
We've
العادي
seen
أكثر ما عم
encouraging
بتأثر على
trends.
الشركات الكبيرة.
That isn't happening. And there are
إذا
other
صار
ways
في
we can bring
بطالة
prices
وهيك
down
هيدي
instead of
بتأثر على
lowering
الشخص
demand.
العادي
Again,
بأمريكا
making people
أكثر
poor,
من غيره.
laying people off, denying worker raises. We can speed up and strengthen our supply chains. We can bring critical manufacturing back to the U.S. We can rebuild our infrastructure. It's what we're doing with the CHIPS Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. For the first time in decades, we're finally recognizing the damage that I and many of my colleagues warned the corporate offshoring would do to our economy. Look at East Palestine, Ohio, a community that Senator Vance and I have visited a number of times recently. America learned about this small town last month when a Norfolk Southern train derailed and spewed hazardous material into this community. East Palestine is more than just a disaster headline. Columbiana County was once the center of American ceramics manufacturing, at one time producing 80% of ceramics of dishware in this country. One county produced 80% of it. When I was there last week, I was talking to the sheriff at the 1820 Candle Company. He was talking about how the last one closed just a few years back. Like so many industries, these jobs moved overseas, and we know why. The same reason Norfolk Southern cuts cost at the expense of safety, eliminating one third of its workforce in the last 10 years. Then you're surprised with these derailments? It's the same reason corporations now keep prices high, even as supply chains stabilize. It's the Wall Street business model. Chair Powell knows that. I know that. My Republican colleagues and Democratic colleagues know that. It's a Wall Street business model. Quarter after quarter, corporations are expected to cut costs at any cost. They skimp on safety. They move production overseas to countries where they can pay workers less because of trade deals that they lobby for. And Wall Street demands they post profit increases, even in the middle of a global pandemic. That's the problem with our economy. And not only will higher interest rates not solve it, if they're overdone, they'll make it worse. We can't risk undermining one of the successes of our current economy. For the first time in decades, workers are finally starting to get a little power in this economy. Unemployment's at a historic low, 3.4%. That's not just a number. That means Americans have more opportunities, more options, even in places.
ارتفاع الدولار لصالح العملات لا إذا ارتفع الدولار الأمريكي بيهبط أسواق الأسهم وأسواق العملات.
Retirement security and paid sick days and some control over their schedules. It means more Americans have the dignity that comes with a good job.
ضروري ما نكسر هون ما نكسر هيدي النقطة اللي هون كثير مهمة تقريبا لل 300 ل 20 600 ضروري ما نكسرها لأنه بنكون عملنا invalidation بنصير عملنا lower high يعني في معقول نهبط أكثر.
It's not just monetary policy that threatens American pocketbooks. Some of my colleagues have threatened the nation's full faith and credit by holding the debt ceiling hostage for partisan politics.
طيب يلا
Instead of paying our bills on time, they're essentially threatening all Americans. The Fifth Circuit's Consumer Financial Protection Bureau ruling
بالمجمل شو عم بيقولوا عم بيعيد حاله انه زيادة فوائد عم بتخلي هاللعبة منيحة لوول ستريت عم بيخفضوا الموظفين العالم عم
doubt about it.
تتضايق
The
من
Fifth Circuit
هالأمر.
is Wall Street's
هالشي ما عم
favorite
يساعد،
courthouse.
بس عم يتركوا
It
أسعارهم مثل ما
recently
هي.
ruled the
ليه؟
CFPB's
لأنه عم
independent funding
يعملوا
is
أرباح
unconstitutional.
بروفيتيرنج
If the
على
Supreme
حساب
Court
الشخص
upholds
العادي.
the Fifth Circuit's
هيدا هو
ruling,
اللي عم بيتاجروا
it will
فيه،
not
يعني عم
only
بيقول هو.
devastate CFPB, it will
القصة من
threaten the
وول ستريت
independent
مش من
funding of
كل
many
شيء
other
بزيادة
federal
الفوائد.
agencies, including the Federal Reserve. I look forward today hearing today's hearing how the Fed will balance its dual mandate and continue to promote an economy where everyone who wants a good job can find one, an economy that works for everyone. Senator Scott. Sorry.
هذا سيناتور سكوت.
Morning, Chairman Powell. Sitting here, looking at my prepared remarks, thinking about, there's an opening coming where Vice Chairman Brainer's moving on. I think it's really important for us to make sure that all the information that we need in order to make a good decision on the next nom that we have in a timely fashion. So I would really implore the chair to make sure that happens, that every questionnaire that is asked from the person, we get. Every member of this committee has their questions answered in a timely fashion, and that the staff has their answers in a timely fashion. Listening to Chairman Brown, I thought to myself, fascinating, truly fascinating. I concluded that, well, I know Chairman Brown pretty well. I am sure he is sincere in his rant. But let me just say this. Spending and printing trillions of dollars,
تطبيع الأموال,
caving to the radical left in this country, seeing policies posited and then implemented that led to the worst inflation in 40 years. Seeing our inflation at 9.1%.
هي اللي
Seeing
أدت
American
لأعلى نسبة
families
تضخم
struggle because
بتاريخ
of the weight of the
الدولة.
government on their shoulders. Seeing the devastation from South Carolina to Ohio. It's unbelievable that the progressives in this country who caused a 9.1% inflation would then turn somewhere besides in the mirror to see the absolute devastation caused by their out-of-control spending is remarkable. Remarkable.
هالتطبيع
To stop the out-of-control inflation caused by the out-of-control spending, the Fed steps in
صرفوا بطريقة
to
غير واعية.
cool the economy. Well, the
الفد هلا
definition of cooling the
دخل
economy
ليخفض
is
الاقتصاد.
necessary because we've seen the most radical approach to a problem that was in our rearview mirror being used as a Trojan horse to bring in a level of socialism and spending that our
عم
nation
يحكي
has
عن
not
التطبيع
seen
وكيف
in my
صرفوا بطريقة
lifetime.
غير واعية.
The facts are very simple. When you get to
الوقائع واضحة.
9.1% inflation in this nation, as a kid who grew up in a single-parent household, mired in poverty, a 40% today, 100% just a year ago increase in the gas prices devastates single mothers
40%
around
زيادة
this
هلا
country. For seniors
و100% من
on
سنة
fixed
زيادة
income
البترول أو
whose
الغاز.
savings are being depleted with an average cost just last month of a $433 increase because of inflation. For my friends on
هذا
the other
بسبب
side of the
التضخم.
aisle to look any place besides a mirror, I find stunning. The truth is that when your food prices go up over 20%,
وقت
when your
أسعار
electricity
الأكل
is up over 20%,
فوق
you have to
20%.
ask yourself, where in the world are they? They
وين عم
cannot
بيروحوا؟
be in this universe. It must be an alternate universe where, in fact, it's okay for us to see prices go through the roof and our economy not stumble, but fall into a ditch. Why are we in the ditch? Because progressives used the pandemic as a way to usher in a form of spending that takes the money out of
هي
the
السياسات خلت
pockets of
العالم
everyday
تصرف
Americans
أموالها ليسحبوا
and puts it
الأموال من
in the
السوق.
coffers of the government. There is a better way. The better way is to trust the American people. And when you do so, we don't have to have the Fed come in and raise interest rates so high
نعلي
to
الفوائد.
quell the challenges
ما
in
لنا
our economy.
مضطرين نعلي
So that
الفوائد
today
هالقد
versus 18 months ago, the price of the same house for your mortgage payment is twice as high.
مدفوعاتك
Why? Because of the
للعقارات
runaway
تبعك الفوائد
spending.
عليه مرتين
My
أعلى من
friends on the
السنة
other side of the
الماضية.
aisle.
ليه؟
I'm sure I do not have time for my opening comments. What I will say without any question, as I look around the country,
أنا وعم
and
بطلع
I ask myself, how devastating is it that today it costs $433 more than it did a year ago? The answer is it is a crisis.
نحن
When the average
بأزمة
family in our country just a couple of years ago didn't have $400 in their savings for an emergency,
العالم عم تخسر أموال كتير بسبب زيادات
by
الفوائد.
this amount.
هول السناترز
It's
كنت
devastating.
تتذكروا هول
To have a
شغلتهم يحكوا
conversation
هيك
about
ليه؟
rents
لأنه القرار
around the
بإيد
country,
جيروم باول، بس هول
looking at the
منتخبين
inflationary
من
effect
الشعب.
and the
إذا الشعب
absolute
شافهم هن مع زيادة
devastation
الفوائد، زيادة
of a
الفوائد دايما
snarling
هي
supply
ما حدا
chain
بيحبها. إذا الشعب
that we haven't
شافهم
seen in my
مع
lifetime,
زيادة الفوائد
run
رح
by
يبطل
my
ينتخبهم.
friends
سو
of the
دايما هول
progressives.
ضد زيادة الفوائد، والسياسة العامة هي
Unbelievable.
لجيروم باول.
But to get to you, Chairman Powell,
مضطر أعلي
one of
الصوت
the comments that
لأسمع
you
أنا.
made that I think is really
هلا
important.
بده
One
يحكي
of the things
جيروم
you gave
باول.
January, and I apologize for my rant. I just wanted to make sure my rant was consistent with my friend here. It is essential, you said, that we stick to our statutory goals and authorities, and that we resist the temptation to broaden our scope to address other important social issues of the day.
عفوا.
Taking on new goals, however worthy, without a clear statutory mandate would undermine the case of our independence. You further noted that, and I quote, without explicit congressional legislation, it would be inappropriate for us to use our monetary policy or supervisory tools to promote a greener economy or to achieve other climate-based goals. We are not and will not be a climate policymaker. Do you still stand by those comments?
Okay.
I do.
Thank you. Finally, I know we're not in the question. I know, I get it. Finally,
You now have 4 minutes and 12 seconds.
yes, I knew the chairman would dock that from my time, and I appreciate you doing so with a great humor. Great humor. Finally, several of my Republican colleagues and I sent a letter to you discussing Vice Chair of Supervision Michael Barr's plan to conduct a holistic review of capital standards. I look forward to discussing those capital standards during my
بده
Q&A.
يناقش
And I will
هالموضوع
thank
مع
you
كم
for
موضوع معه.
our recent conversation that we had that helped illuminate some of the necessary challenges that we face as a nation and your answers to it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Speaking of illuminating, thank you, Senator Scott.
هذا هو.
Thank you for allowing me to use this.
Today we'll hear from Chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, on monetary policy in the state of our economy. And I don't expect Chair Powell to weigh in on the mini debate we just had, but I think we all know that the debt increase was much larger under President Trump and a Republican Senate than it has been since. Chair Powell, thank you for your service and your testimony today.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and other members of the committee.
Okay,
I
هلا
appreciate the
بلش.
opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation is causing significant hardship, and we're
احنا
strongly
بنعرف
committed
زيادة
to
التضخم
returning
عم
inflation
بيصعب
to
الأمور
our
على حياة
2% goal.
الأمريكيين.
Over the past year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy. We have covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Our policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices. Without price stability,
هدفنا
the
رح
economy
نخفض
does not
الفوائد.
work
اشتغلنا
for
كتير
anyone.
وبعد
In
عنا شغل
particular,
كتير.
without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of labor market conditions that benefit all. I'll review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. The data from January on employment, consumer spending, manufacturing production, and inflation have partly reversed the softening trends that we'd seen in the data just a month ago. Some of this reversal likely reflects the unseasonably warm weather in January in much of the country. Still, the breadth of the reversal, along with revisions to the previous quarter, suggests that Inflationary pressures are running higher than expected at the time of our
أرقام
previous
التضخم هي بعدها أعلى من المتوقع لأنه شفنا
From a
هالشي
broader
الشهر الماضي.
perspective, inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year, but remains well above the FOMC's longer
هلا
run objective of
انخفض من
2%.
نص السنة الماضي ولكن بعده
12-month
أعلى
change
بكثير
in
من
total
المتوقع.
PCE inflation has slowed from its peak of 7% in June to 5.4% in January, as energy prices have declined and supply chain bottlenecks have eased. Over the past 12 months,
بشكل عام
core
عم
PCE
يترجم
inflation,
هو
which
شو
excludes the
صار.
volatile
كان
food
التضخم
and energy
عالي
prices,
انخفض
was
ولكن بعده
4.7%
كتير عالي ومضطر هو
as
يضله
supply chain
عم
bottlenecks have
يلجم
eased and
أو
tighter
يضله في
policy has
سياسة تشدد
restrained
ليوصل
demand.
لأهدافه.
Inflation in the core goods sector has fallen. And while housing services inflation remains too high, the flattening out in rents evident in recently signed leases points to a deceleration in this component of inflation over the year ahead. That said, there is little sign of disinflation thus far in the category of core services excluding housing, a category that accounts for more than half of core consumer expenditures. To restore price stability, we'll need to see lower inflation in this sector, and there will very likely be some softening in the labor market conditions.
بده يصير في انخفاض
Although nominal
باليد
wage
العاملة
gains
يعني يصير
have
في
slowed
يزيد
somewhat in
البطالة.
recent months, they remain above what is consistent with 2% inflation and current trends in productivity. Strong wage growth is good for workers, but only if it's not eroded by inflation. Turning to growth, the U.S. economy has slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 0.9%. Although consumer spending appears to be expanding at a solid pace this quarter, other recent indicators point to subdued growth of spending and production.
اوكي في كتير امور عم
Activity in the housing sector continues to weaken, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower
عفواً،
output
توني
growth
ثانية بدي
also
أشوف
appear
شغلة
to be
هون.
weighing on business fixed investment. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight. The unemployment rate was 3.4% in January,
أرقام البطالة
its
بعدها
lowest
كتير
level since
منخفضة.
1969. Job gains remained very strong in January, while the supply of labor has
سوق
continued
اليد
to
العاملة
lag.
بعده كتير قوي.
As of the end of December, there were 1.9 job openings for each unemployed individual, close to the all-time peak recorded last March, while unemployment insurance claims have remained near historical lows. Turning to monetary policy. With inflation well above our longer-run goal of 2%, and with the labor market remaining extremely tight, the FOMC has continued to tighten the stance of monetary policy, raising interest rates by 4.5 percentage points over the
هيك
past year.
شكله.
We
اوكي.
continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a
بده
stance of
يضل يزيد
monetary policy
الفوائد.
that is
هو هذا
sufficiently
الطريق
restrictive to
المضبوط
return inflation
لحتى
to
يوصل
2%
لهدفه.
over time. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet.
عم
We
بيعمل
are seeing the
سياسة عم
effects of
يسحب
our
سيولة من
policy actions
السوق
on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the
على
economy.
فترة.
It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee slowed the pace of interest rate increases over its past two
الجمعية
meetings.
خفضت نسبة زيادة
We will
الفوائد
continue to
ل
make our decisions meeting by
0.25%
meeting, taking into account the totality of the
لأنه
incoming
الوضع
data and
العام
their
عم
implications
يتأثر
for the outlook
بهالموضوع
for economic
ولكن ما فيهم
activity
يخفضوا قبل ما
and
يوصلوا
inflation.
لهدفهم.
Although inflation has been moderating in recent months, the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go and is likely to be bumpy. As I mentioned, the latest economic data have come in stronger than expected, which suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than previously
شباب
anticipated.
بتمنى عليكم تعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب
If the
للشانل
totality of
بليز.
the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we'd be prepared to increase the pace of rate hikes. Restoring price stability will likely require that we maintain a restrictive stance of monetary policy for some time. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to set
هدفنا
the stage for
نرجع
achieving maximum employment and
نثبت
stable
الأسعار
prices over the longer run.
نلاقي
The
ثبات
historical
بالأسعار.
record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy, We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses
نحن
across
بنعرف
the
إنه
country.
اللي نعمله
Everything
عم
we do
بيأثر على
is
العالم
for
وعلى العيال
population. The Federal
ولكن
Reserve, we will do
مضطرين
everything we
نعمله
can to achieve
لحتى
our maximum
لنحمي
employment
الاقتصاد.
and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
هلا بده يبلش
Thank you,
ياخذ
Mr. Chair.
أسئلة.
There are
هون المهم.
23 of us on this committee. Almost everyone will be here today.
هلا ببلش المهم. عادة أجوبته عن الأسئلة بنشوف السياسة تبع الفيدرالي.
Thank you all for your cooperation. Chair Powell, thank you. Job growth is strong as unemployment remains historically low. You might not know that from the opening statements. Many drivers of inflation, corporate greed, rising inequality, supply chain disruptions, Russia's bestiality, if you will, in Ukraine won't get better because of interest rate increases. Every indication is that this post-pandemic economy is different. Should we be worried, Mr. Chair, that the Fed is treating this economic period as it has in the past instead of
هل لازم
reacting
نخاف لأنه أنتم
differently?
عم تعملوا هيدا الوضع مثل ما عملتوا وضع اقتصادي
Mr.
سابق؟
Chairman. So we've been aware since the very beginning and have discussed this publicly on many occasions that there are some differences this time. We, in particular,
بنعرف في
have
أمور
not seen the
مختلفة.
kind of supply side collapse that we saw at the very beginning of the inflation outbreak. Also, the outbreak of a war, which had significant effects on commodity
بنعرف
prices.
الحرب، بنعرف
So
الموضوع
all that is
بالصين عم
different.
بيأثر
There
كتير
are
على
also, though,
التضخم.
some similarities. There is a mismatch between supply and demand. You can see that in the goods sector still. You saw it in housing prices going up over 40% since before the pandemic, and you see it in the labor market where we have 1.9 job openings for every opening, for every unemployed person. So we're well aware that this particular situation involves a mix of cycles of
نعرف في
forces,
أمور
not
غير
all of
الأمور
which our
السابقة
tools can affect, but there is
ولكن
a
في
job
أمور
here
مشابهة
for us to
كمان.
do in better aligning demand with supply.
Okay, understanding you have limited tools to address inflation, and our conversations in the past show my concern about continued rate increases that may not actually address the root cause of inflation. They hurt workers, and many of us
وتوصل لهي الخط ارتد.
Next question. Last year, 3 banking regulators issued proposed updates on the Community Reinvestment Act to account for changes in our banking system. My question is, does the Fed remain committed to work with FDIC and OCC to finalize a CRA
هدفه
rule, and when
ينزل
will that
التضخم
rule
ل
likely be
2% على
finalized?
الحال لو
Yes,
شو
we
ما
do
صار.
remain committed, and I believe we are in broad agreement with the other 2 agencies on the revisions to the rule. So now we're in the process of writing all that down, and that'll take some time. And then after that, of course, it will come to the Board of Governors for a vote, and that'll involve briefings and discussions. And I can't give you an exact date, but
As quickly as possible.
Yes, but it will be some months.
Okay, thank you. Banks weathered the shock of the COVID-19 shutdowns mostly because of the fiscal response provided by Congress. We now see a spike in loan delinquencies, an increase in overall risk. Banks are again plowing billions, as many other corporate leaders always defended by people on that side of the aisle, into stock buybacks, which makes me concerned that there's a downturn in the economy. Banks could end up with too little capital. That's why I'm worried about any potential rollbacks of safeguards or regulations. Can you assure me that the Fed will keep capital requirements strong and exercise more long-term forward-thinking than corporate CEOs that seem to be focused on the short term?
I can assure you as to the first part that we'll keep capital requirements strong.
I didn't expect you to comment on give me an opinion about you're looking more forward than companies that look at the short-term benefits of stock buybacks. Mr. Chair, when you last testified, I asked you about the risk posed by crypto assets, stablecoin, the Fed, and other regulated possibilities. How's the Fed evaluating the risks of crypto-related activities?
كيف عم بتحددوا مخاطر الكريبتو؟
So this is something we've been quite active in this area, and I'll say that we believe that innovation is very important over time to the
التطور شيء مهم كثير بنآمن
We
فيه.
don't want regulation to stifle innovation in a way that just
ما بدنا القوانين تأثر على التطور.
But like everyone else, we're watching what's been happening in the crypto space, and
عم
what
ننظر
we see is quite a lot of turmoil. We see fraud. We see a lack of transparency. We see
عم
run
نشوف
risk,
كتير اشياء
lots and lots
مثل
of things like that. And so
تنصيب
what we've
وامور
been doing
ومخاطر
is
بالكريبتو.
making sure that the regulated financial institutions that we supervise and regulate are careful, are taking great care in the ways that
لازم
they
نعرف
engage
الإدارة
with the whole
تبع
crypto
هالأمور
space, and that they
تكون
give us prior
عارفة
notice.
شو عم
And
تعمل
we've issued,
وواضحة.
along with the FDIC and the OCC, a number of issuances of notices to that effect.
Thank you. And I will close with this. I've long pushed for the Fed to prioritize workers and for the leaders of the Fed to reflect the diversity of our country. We've made progress.
في
Our
التطور
work is
صح.
not done. We have a new opening. Understand, it's not your job to appoint the new Fed member. We have a number of upcoming vacancies at the reserve banks. I support Senator Reid from
عجبني
Rhode
حكي
Island,
بطريقة
Senator Anderson,
إيجابية
New
إنه
Jersey,
هو
and
ما
other
بده يوقف
colleagues who are
التطور
pushing for more
ولكن بده
diverse
ينظمه. حلو
voices at the
قال
Fed.
شيء حلو
Senator
كتير.
Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, the chairman and I both have strong passions about the challenges that we face as a country. The one thing that I do believe that we agree on is the importance of having a strong capital markets as it relates to making sure that
بتحس
Americans have the ability to continue to grow their businesses and to solve their challenges. Frankly, I hope that we
22,200.
get there. Building on the same comment that Chairman had around capital standards is where I'm going to go with my thoughts today. When I think back on these last few years, it's hard not to recognize the extraordinary efforts our financial institutions of all sizes, frankly, undertook to administer a program like the PPP, all while weathering a shutdown of our global economy. I welcome your thoughts, but from my viewpoint, our banking system was resilient. Our financial institutions stepped up and delivered aid
شركاتنا
to
والبنوك
support
تبعنا
families
ضلوا
and
قوية.
businesses every single day. That's why Vice Chair Barr's broad comments around holistic review of our capital trouble me so much. We should be laser focused on our economy and addressing the needs of everyday Americans trying to forge a new future and helping them open the door to opportunity. As you and I both know, capital and its quality must be continually scrutinized, but increased capital does not necessarily provide an increased benefit, and requiring banks to hold capital that is not
لازم نجبر البنوك
risk-based
يحملوا
and
أموال
appropriately tailored to a bank's size, scope,
حسب
and
كبر البنك،
activities
حسب
can cause more harm than good.
حسب كل
At a
الأمور.
time of record inflation, where everyday needs are more expensive, we should not be pursuing actions that are harmful.
عشان بدي أشوف شغلة تانية صراحة هو
We should
عم
be
يحكي.
supporting the engine of our economy, small businesses. While I remain greatly concerned by the Vice Chair's comments, I am hopeful that you will ensure this review is appropriate, keeping the impacts on our banking system front and center. We must promote and further the growth of our economy and thereby our people. Anything less should be unacceptable.
يا
To
باطل
that end, will you commit
صارت
that
احتمالية
any
زيادة
ongoing
الفوائد
capital review by the Federal
0.5%
Reserve
أعلى
will follow the law
من
and that
من
any
نسبة
follow-on
من
regulatory proposals will
0.25.
be risk-based and tailored to an institution's
هيدا
activity,
تطور كتير
size,
جديد،
and
انتبهوا منه
complexity,
هيدا
and not a
تطور كتير مهم هيدا.
one-size-fits-all.
Yes, I can easily commit to that. We're very strongly committed to tailoring, and I can say that anything we do will reflect tailoring, which is a long-held principle for us and also now a requirement in the law.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. 2 weeks ago, I sent a letter with Chairman McHenry to Chair Gensler regarding the SEC's climate disclosure rule, urging him to rescind his proposal and reminding him that the SEC is a market regulator, not a climate forecaster. Much like Congress designed
عم
the
يحكوا عن
SEC
جاري
to protect
جانستر،
investors,
قالوا له
to
انت عم
maintain
يعمل
fair,
وظائف مش
orderly,
إله،
and efficient
حاجي
markets,
يتدخل ان شاء
and
الله يحلوا
facilitate
له من
capital
ايده الا
formation,
نحذر
and not to
نحل
advance
عنا هيدا
progressive
جنزله.
climate change policies. Congress designed the Federal Reserve to promote price stability and maximum employment, not to play politics. To that end, I find worrying the Fed's announcement of recent actions to consider climate-related scenarios, coupled with remarks by the Vice Chair of Supervision, as attempts to incorporate broader ESG policies into the financial
عم بيقولوا كتير منهم عم
services sector.
يتصرفوا على أساس البيئة وما بيئة، هن ما خصهم بالسياسة، لازم يهتموا جاري جانسلر والفيدرال بوليسيز يكونوا بس لهم علاقة بالأموال.
Far into the future, fall outside the scope of their authority. Importantly, the level of speculation required in these models should highlight their arbitrary and capricious nature. At a time when our economy is suffering from historically high inflation, I expect our central bank to focus its time and resources on bringing inflation down, not on policy.
لازم نركز بس على تخفيض التضخم مش على السياسات اللي عليها بالضرر البيئي والاي اس جي وكل هالامور. انا هذا فاجأني كثير هذا الرقم هلا.
Do you agree that the Federal Reserve does not have the authority or statutory direction to use its monetary policy or supervisory tools to wade into the ESG or other climate policies?
I do. As you know, there's a tightly focused role that we do have that I believe that we have, but I would agree with your statement.
هو بيوافقوا.
I have 20 seconds left, but I'm going to defer because of my earlier question to my opening statement.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Menendez is close, but not here yet. So, Senator.
صاروا نص بنص يا باطل.
Nice try.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
صاروا نص بنص. احتمال زيادة الفوائد 0.50%. نص بنص صارت.
As you know, both core and headline inflation have remained persistently elevated. And over the past 12 months, real average hourly earnings fell by 1.8%, about 4% since President Biden took office. To make ends meet as prices increase, more Americans are leaning on
اللي فاجأني محمد انه امبارح قبل ما نام كانت 30% هون. هاي الاحتمالية 0.5 كانت 30% طلعت ل 50% يعني بظرف 4 ساعات اللي فت على النوم فيه. And an average credit card balance rose to $5,805. Over the past year, the Fed has acted aggressively to tame inflation, and yet we are still seeing price increases. As we've discussed this several times, but I recognize that it's been an ongoing discussion, but I believe that this further proves that الحديث تبع كل هول السناترز عم بيكون هن ضد سياسة زيادة الفوائد، بس مرة تانية هول منتخبين بدهم الشعب يحبهم، كلهم ضد الزيادات، ولكن القرار النهائي لجيروم باول مش لإلهم، هن بس عم يسألوه وحديثهم عم بيكون كله إنه زيادة الفوائد عم تأذي المواطن العادي وما عم بتأثر بشكل كتير كبير على التضخم، هيك هن كلهم عم يحكوا.
Challenges brought out when you have a policy is promoting higher prices with regard to
energy, البيتكوين
as opposed to what you're trying to do, which is to bring down the total overall cost. And I just wanted to ask, I guess, and you're going to think this is something that we've heard before, but do you believe that you currently have the monetary policy tools to actually reduce inflation? And I just put it in this perspective. In January of 2021, the CPI was 1.4%. When the Biden administration began. January of 2022, and this is before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, CPI was at 7.5%, 7.5%. Today, March of 2022, CPI is 8.5%. Wouldn't it be fair to assess that a lot of the policy or the inflation that we've seen here may very well be due to policy decisions by this administration?
ما فينا نقول إنه زيادة الأرقام
not for us
تضخم مش بسبب الحرب.
Our job is to use our tools. You asked whether we have the tools to get this job done, and we do. Over time, there are some things that we can't affect, but over time we can achieve 2%
نستعمل الوسائل اللي عندنا إياها يلي هي زيادة زيادة
You've got a
الفوائد.
limited number of tools available to you, and the limited number of tools that you have are designed to impact simply the reduction in prices and so forth, and yet if there are competing interests out there that are pushing prices higher, you don't have the wherewithal to decide one tool versus another based on whether it's policy induced or whether it is a matter of a shortage in supplies from outside or whether it's war related.
That's right. Our tools essentially work on demand, moderating.
قدراتنا بنقدر نتحكم بالعرض والطلب.
If there were policies in place that actually help to reduce inflation, in other words, and by that, I'm just going to look at energy alone, just as a good example. If policies were in place that were actually allowing energy prices to come down in the United States, then you would have less of a need to use the very blunt tools that you do have right now with regard
إذا طلعت قوانين أو بتجبر مثلا الكهرباء تنخفض بالولايات المتحدة، أنك هالشيء بخليك ما تضطر تزيد الفوائد وتستعمل الأمور تبعك.
What the president's doing on his on his energy policy. I just want to make it clear that you have to respond to what's in front of you, and it doesn't matter where the inflation is coming from or what's driving it up. You're simply trying to bring it back down to that 2% number with the only tools that you've really got.
Yes.
Yeah.
I will say
انت
on
هدفك
energy,
بس تخفض
energy has tended over time
التضخم ل 2%
to
بغض
fluctuate up and
النظر
down, and
شو عم
it's not
بيصير
mainly
بالاقتصاد.
affected by
يعني
our
اذا
tools.
بيعملوا
So,
سياسات
the things we
وتخفض
look
انت
at are really
مش
things that
مضطر
are
تزيد
tightly
الفوائد هالقد.
linked to
قال له
demand of
انا
the
هيدي
US economy.
هيدي
Those we can affect.
الامور
And I
اللي
think
عندي
just the
اياها
fact that you've been
اللي فيني
increasing it
استخدمها.
quicker,
هيدي
you've been increasing
الامور اللي
interest
تحت
rates,
ايدي حاليا
yet
بستخدمها.
inflation continues to ride up.
بحسب
Would
المعطيات اللي
suggest
عم
that
تجي.
you've just indicated
المعطيات اذا
that we have
تغيرت
higher
انا
interest
بغير
rates
السياسه تبعي.
to impact that part of it with the monetary policy that you've got available to you.
So we focus on everything, but we also focus on core in particular, which doesn't include energy prices. And what's happened is core inflation has come down, but nowhere near as fast as we might have hoped, and it has a long way to go.
Thank you. One last question. Last June, Vice Chairman of Supervision Michael Barr testified before this committee that he would defend the use of the aggregation method as an alternative approach to the insurance capital standards, the ICS, proposed by the IAIS. As the final compatibility criteria set to come out later this year, can you confirm that you share Vice Chair Barr's views on this AM?
I will confirm that, but I'll have to get back to you on the status of that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to take this moment to remind my colleagues that there are more than 62 million Latinos that call the United States home. We are the largest minority group in the country. We account for nearly 20% of the United States population. We contribute almost $3
مرة
trillion.
تانية بتمنى تعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب
Yet
للشانل.
Latinos have no representation in the Federal Reserve's leadership. In the 109-year history of the Federal Reserve, there has never been a single member of the Board of Governors or regional bank president who has the lived experience of being Latino in the United States. And in practice, that means that the
كان
voices
بيعملوا
of nearly
دعايات
one-fifth
لحالهم يا
of
عمي
our country's
انه هذا
people are
اساسه
repeatedly
من
drowned out
مكسيكي
when
او
the Fed is
لاتن
making political
فرنانديز.
decisions on economic
عم
policy.
يحكي انه بحياته ما
Decisions that
كان في
affect
حدا
whether a
من
Latino family can
اصول
afford their first
لاتينيه
home,
الرئيس ما
find a
بعرف شو
job
عم
that
يحكي.
pays a living
عم يعملوا
wage,
دعايات
send their children to
انتخابيه هول
college,
بحسهم
save for a comfortable
قبل ما يعملوا
retirement, or
سؤال
get a
بيعملوا
loan to
مقدمه
expand their
مثل بيان
business.
انتخابي هيك
Right
بس.
now, the Biden administration has a clear
ذكرونا بالانتخابات
opportunity
عندنا
to
بلبنان
make
بيطلعوا
history
كلهم
with
بيحكوا.
its next nomination to the Board of Governors. It has identified a number of highly qualified Latino candidates who have dedicated their careers to the fields of economics, who are committed to the Fed's dual mandate, who will preserve the independence of the central bank. The administration has rightly nominated and advocated for a number of diverse candidates with similar qualifications, both at the Fed and elsewhere. But despite having 5 opportunities over the past 2 years to nominate a qualified Latino economist to serve
عم
as the
يحكي عن
Federal Reserve, this
الشعب
administration has
اللاتيني
repeatedly chosen
يعني المكسيكي
not to.
برازيلي اللي
Representation
هولهم
or lack thereof does not
ما في شيء
happen by
مهم هون.
accident. It is a choice. And I hope the administration makes the right choice with this nomination. Mr. Chairman, would you say that it is a truism that the United States dollar is the reserve of choice in the world?
Yes, I would.
And that brings us enormous benefits, does it not?
Yes, it does.
Now, 12 years ago, a Republican House brought us to the brink of defaulting on the debt for the first time in history of this country, jeopardizing our credit and the world economy. I'm getting a sense of deja vu because, once again, Republicans are recklessly demanding draconian spending cuts to programs that hardworking U.S. families rely on in exchange for allowing the Treasury Department to pay for spending that Congress, including most of them, have already voted to authorize. You want to talk about spending cuts. It seems to me that the budget is the time to do that, but not to put the full faith and credit of the United States at risk. Chairman Powell, can you talk about the catastrophic damage a debt default would inflict on the economy?
فيك تقلنا إذا صار في ديفولت ما قدروا يدفعوا ديونهم شو رح يأثر على الأسواق على الاقتصاد تبعنا؟
We do not seek to play a role in these policy issues.
نحن مش دورنا بالسياسات هيدي أمور للسياسيين.
whatever else may happen will happen, but Congress really needs to raise the debt ceiling. That's the only way out, in a timely way that allows us to pay all of our bills when and as due. And if we fail to do so, I think that the consequences are hard to estimate, but they could be extraordinarily adverse, and could do long-standing harm.
أكيد ممكن تكون سيئة جدا بس ما فينا
a mild
نقدر.
statement of what would happen. I understand. I didn't ask you to engage in the congressional executive branch roles. I asked you about the abstract question of what happens if you have a debt default. Isn't even this constant fight putting into question the possibility that the United States will not honor its full faith and credit have consequences within the economy?
In principle, it could. I think markets tend and observers tend to watch this and tend to think that it will work out, and it has in the past worked out. So it needs to work out this time too.
Now, seeing your testimony before the committee, is it fair to say that you'll do whatever is necessary to tame inflation?
هل انت رح تعمل شو ما مضطر لحتى تلجم التضخم؟ كل شيء فينا نعمله رح نعمله لنلجم التضخم. شو ما بدنا نضطر نعمل رح نعمل.
Additional rate increases, would it not? What other tool do you have?
That's what we have. The balance sheet, the shrinkage of the balance sheet will continue too, but it's principally rate hikes.
So the question is, when does that part of doing anything necessary to tame inflation, come into conflict with your other mandate of maximum employment?
Not now, when we have the lowest unemployment in 54 years.
هلا لجنة التضخم مهم بس البطالة مهم، بس هلا أكيد مش الوقت لأنه عندنا أوطى نسبة بطالة بتاريخ أمريكا، سو بعد معنا وقت.
But it really isn't now, where we're very far from our price stability mandate, and in effect, the economy is past most estimates of maximum employment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Menendez. Senator Kennedy of Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, thank you for being here. Thank you to you and your team for helping to save the economy during the pandemic meltdown. For what it's worth, I'm generally supportive of the actions of the Fed right now, and I'm not going to ask you today to blame anybody. When Congress spends money, it stimulates the economy, does it not?
Well, it would depend on whether that's funded by tax increases or not. But so if there's a spending that's not accompanied by taxes, would have a net at the margin stimulative effect.
Well, and when Congress borrows money to spend even more, that stimulates the economy even more, does it not?
At the margin, yeah.
Okay.
عم يسأل إذا وقت الكونغرس يتدين مصاري ويصرف
If
مصاري
Congress
شو بتأثير على
reduced
على
the
الاقتصاد.
rate of growth in its spending and reduced the rate of growth in its debt accumulation, it would make your job easier in reducing inflation, would it not?
I don't think fiscal policy right now is a big factor driving inflation at this moment, but it's absolutely essential that we do slow the pace of growth, particularly for the areas of the budget.
All right, let's try to unpack this then. I'm not trying to trick you. You're raising interest rates. You're raising interest rates to slow the economy, are you not?
أنت عم بتزيد الفوائد لتخفف
And
نمو
one of the ways
الاقتصاد.
you measure your success, other than fluctuation in gross domestic product, is the unemployment rate. Is it not?
Yes, one of the measures.
Okay. So in effect, I'm not being critical. When you're slowing the economy, you're trying to put people out of work. That's your job, is it not?
Not really. We're trying to restore price stability.
No, you're trying to raise
not wages.
You're trying to raise the unemployment rate.
There are
that mean I know you don't like the phrase, so let me strike it. You're trying to raise the unemployment rate, are you not?
No, we're not trying to raise it. We're
عم
trying to
بتجرب تزيد
realign supply and
البطالة.
demand,
قال له
which
لا
could
ماني عم
happen
جرب
through a
زيد
bunch of
البطالة.
channels. Like, for example,
بدي رد ثبات
there's just job
الأسعار.
openings.
All right,
Job
let
openings
me
could
put it another way, okay? The economists did a wonderful study. They looked at 10 disinflationary periods in America going all the way back to the 1950s. Disinflation is what you're trying to do. It's a slowing in the rate of inflation.
تخفيض
right?
بسرعة
Yes.
التضخم.
In other words, prices don't go down, they just don't go up as fast. Deflation is when prices actually go down.
Yeah.
You're trying to achieve disinflation, are you not?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Based on history, in the 10 times that we got inflation down, disinflation since the 1950s,
Okay.
in order to reduce inflation by 2%, unemployment had to go up 3.6%.
بآخر
That's
كذا
history,
سنة
is it not?
بآخر
I don't
كذا
have the numbers in front of me, but
سنين
yes, the
وقت
standard has
بدنا
been that there
نخفض
have
من
been
قيمة التضخم
recessions and
ونخفضه
downturns.
البطالة لازم
Okay.
The Fed
تطلع.
has tried to reduce
Now,
inflation.
right now, the current inflation rate 6.4% and the current unemployment rate is 3.4%. Now, if history is right, I'm not asking you to again blame anybody, but if history is right,
إذا التاريخ
unless you get
مزبوط
some help in order to get inflation down from 6.4%
لتهبط
to,
التضخم من
let's say,
6.2%
4.4%, and
لل
the unemployment rate is going to have to rise to
4.4%.
7% based on history.
البطالة
That's
لازم
what the
تعلى
record would say.
ل7%.
Okay.
هيك
And to
حسب
get
التاريخ.
inflation down to 2.2% based on history,
إذا بدك توطيه ل 2%.
an immutable fact, unemployment would have to go to 10.6%.
البطالة لازم تطلع لل
Would it not?
10.6%.
No, I wouldn't.
That's what the record shows. That's what the history shows.
هيك هيك التاريخ بيقول.
I don't think that kind of a number is at all in
I
play
mean,
here.
I know you're reluctant to admit it, and you don't want to get in the middle of a policy dispute.
أنا عارف أنت ما بدك
But I
تتدخل
think it's
بالسياسة.
undeniable. It's undeniable that the only way we're going to get this sticky inflation down is to attack it on the monetary side, which you're doing, and on the fiscal side, which means Congress has got to reduce the rate of growth of spending and reduce the
الطريقة
rate of
الوحيدة
growth
لنوصل
of debt
للهدف
accumulation.
للتضخم لازم يعمل
I
سياسة
get that.
الكونغرس يخفض
You don't want to get in
انفاقه،
the middle of that fine.
وانت اللي عم تعمله
But the
وحدك ما فيك
more
تعملها.
we help
يعني زيادة الفوائد
on
وحدة
the
ما
fiscal
بتعمل كل شيء.
side, the fewer people you're going to have to put out of work. Isn't that a fact?
Please answer.
It could work out that way.
Sir?
It could work out that way.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator
Chairman.
Kennedy. Senator Reid of Rhode Island's recognized.
قال له
Thank
ايه
you very much,
معقول
Mr.
هتكون هيدي
Chairman.
القصة.
Thank you, Chairman.
ذكي هذا
Every day.
اللي سأله هالأسئلة
We
هلا.
saw in the wake of COVID the globalized
يعني عم
supply
يتهموا شوي
chain
سياسة بايدن
disrupted significantly,
والكونغرس
and we're
انه
in the
ليش
process of, in
عملوا
some
سياسات
respects,
مزبوطة،
rebuilding a
خفضوا
supply chain
خفضوا
with emphasis
الانفاق
on
تبعكم
facilitating in the
احسن ما
United States.
تعلى البطالة بشكل كتير
To what
كبير.
extent did that
يعني
disrupt
ما
the supply chain?
الفيدرالي عم يستعمل اللي عنده، اذا هوليك
What
بيعملوا من
extent
اللي
will
عنده
the new,
تنخفض اسرع.
if you envisioned the new supply chain that is located in the United States and other friendly countries affect inflation?
So the initial outbreak of inflation was all about spending on goods where people couldn't spend on services. So goods spending went way up, and the global supply chain, many goods are imported. The global supply chain just collapsed, and that was the source of the original inflation. It has now spread over the last 2 years to housing and also to the rest of the service sector. So to your question, we are seeing goods inflation has been coming down for some time now. It's still too high, but it's coming down. Housing services is there's in the pipeline. You see the new leases that are being signed, and what that tells you is that in the next 6 to 12 months, we will see that come down. But this big service sector, that's everything else, which is financial services, medical services, travel and leisure, all of those things. That's really where that's the source of the inflation we have now, which had nothing to do with the supply, or not much to do with the supply chains. That's where the challenge is now.
And is there anything that you can do that would target that service area
فيك
without
تعمل شيء
affecting the other areas?
There's not really,
لتحدد
our monetary
الخدمات.
policy tools are famously powerful but blunt.
نحن الادوات اللي عنا
In a
اياها
different topic,
قوية، بس هو هن
probably
يعني
aware
زيادة
of the
الفوائد
Fifth
هيك الامور
Circuit
فينا
that
نتعرف فيها.
delivered a ruling in the Community Financial Services Association versus CFPB that the CFPB's funding mechanism is unconstitutional. Just like the Board of Governors, the CFPB is a bureau of the Federal Reserve. Both the Board of Governors and the CFPB rely on the same source of funds and draw on those funds in virtually identical ways. If the Board of Governors funding structure would be found unconstitutional, what would the implications be for the country and monetary policy?
Well, it would be very significant, but I have to say we have significant responsibilities, but I would be reluctant to comment on a case that's before the Supreme Court.
But it is certainly something that you've had people examine for possible ramifications.
Yes, and the central banks tend to be self-funding because of the way they work, and that's a key factor of our independence.
We've gone back and forth on the impact of rate hikes on workers, and you've indicated previously that wages have not been spiraling upwards necessarily, and that inflation expectations are currently stable. But the impact on increased interest rates are usually felt more by low to moderate income people.
زيادة الفوائد عم تأثر على الأشخاص اللي مدخولها محدود.
So where we are right now, of course, is very low unemployment. Wages have been moderating, and they've been doing so without a softening in the labor market, without a rising unemployment, really, and that's a good thing. So we really don't know. The current situation is a combination of more typical supply and demand issues, but also just things that we haven't seen before, like the war in Ukraine, like the supply chains that you mentioned.
Right.
So we have many unusual factors, and I don't think anybody knows with confidence how this is going to play out.
ما حدا بيعرف 100% كيف رح تصير بتأثر على الاقتصاد.
Thanks, Senator Reid. Senator Brett, Alabama is recognized.
Senator تبع ألاباما.
Chairman Powell, it's great to have you here today. Over the past 2 years, we've seen the highest inflation of my lifetime, driving up costs for American families across the board. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, the annual inflation rate in 2021 was 7%, and in 2022, it was 6.5%. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the cost of food went up 10% in 2022. And the real effects of that is moms and dads across this nation that are working to put food
هالشي عم
on the
بيأثر
table
على
for their kids,
الأموات
their babies,
والأبوات.
had a harder time doing that. This has devastated hardworking Americans, causing a kitchen table crisis in every corner of our country.
هالشي عم
As
بيأثر
the
على
price of food,
العالم
energy,
بالبلد.
and housing have all skyrocketed. In response, the Federal Reserve has raised the Federal Reserve Fund rate more than 4 percentage
الدولار
points.
الأمريكي
Being
شاط.
far from transient, inflation has remained persistent, high, and well above the Fed's long-run goal of remaining under 2%. In the coming year, what factors and indicators are you paying attention to as you and the Federal Open Market Committee decide on whether to increase rates?
So I'd say a couple things to that. First, we're going to be looking at inflation in the three sectors that I mentioned: the goods sector, the housing sector, and then the
عم
broader
نطلع
service
تضخم
sector.
بثلاث
And we
مجالات:
need the
البضائع،
inflation that's already
البيوت.
underway in the goods sector to continue, and that's really important. In the housing sector, we just need the time to pass so that reported inflation comes down, and it's effectively in the pipeline as long as new leases are being signed at relatively small increases. So we'll be watching very, very carefully, though, at the larger service sector, which is 56% of the
عم
consumer
نراقب
spending,
عم
more
نراقب
than that
قطاع
of
الخدمات.
what's currently inflation. So that's one thing we'll be watching that very carefully. Also, we raised rates very quickly last year, and we know that monetary policy, tightening policy, has delayed effects. It takes a while for the full effects to be seen.
زدنا الفوائد بشكل سريع السنة الماضية،
So we're watching
وهلا
carefully
بدنا
to see
ننتظر
those effects
لنشوف
come in,
نتيجة
into play.
هالزيادات.
So we're aware that we haven't seen the full effects yet, and we're taking that into account as we think about rate hikes.
So when you're looking at this, obviously not to get into a policy discussion, but if there were an increase of energy production in this country, do you feel like that would help drive down inflation?
إذا صار تصنيع الطاقة هون أو بالبلد، مش هذا بيخفض التضخم؟
But we are very focused on what we call core inflation, because that
هلا التصنيع
is what is
بالبلد
driven
هي
by
بخفض الكلفة، أكيد بتأثر على التضخم.
Right, understood. But I feel like the cost of energy is not just what you pay at the pump. It ends up affecting every good across this great nation.
أنا
Additionally, I'd like to
بعتقد
ask you
زيادة
about labor participation.
الج-
So
ال-
when you look at the
مثل
unemployment
البترول
rate, and we've
أسعارها
heard my
بتأثر على
colleagues
كل شيء،
discuss
مش بس
people
على
having to be displaced in
مش
order
على
for us to
سعر
maybe
البنزين بس، لأنه على الصناعة
like
وعلى
as
كل
a nation.
هالأمور.
I'd
إذا
like to focus
صنعنا
on the
نحن
labor
هون،
participation rate.
هي
So right
إدارة
now it's
بايدن عم بتجرب ما تصنع.
62.4%.
إدارة
If there were an increase in
ترامب
people
وقتها
coming
كان
back
كانوا
into
هن
the
عم
workforce,
بيضخوا
would that
بترول
be
من
a
عندهم من
positive
أمريكا،
factor with
سو عم بيقولوا
regards to
بهيك
driving us
بتخفض
down to the
التضخم
2%
بطريقة
rate that we
مزبوطة،
need to achieve?
بدل ما نضلنا نزيد
I think that
الفوائد
it
وعم
would. I mean,
نستورد
remember,
ونعلي
yes, people
الأسعار.
coming into jobs,
Yes.
that would be great because the economy clearly wants
Yep.
more people than are currently working. Of course, those people would then spend more, so it wouldn't be a zero-sum game, but it would be great for the country and great for them if they were to come into the labor force.
Amen. I believe that increasing in capital requirements on financial institutions would have a chilling effect on the economy and the availability of financial services. And last week, I joined many of my colleagues in sending you a letter that expressed concerns that if the Federal Reserve decides to conduct a, quote, holistic review of capital standards, as we heard Senator Scott talk about earlier. So is the Federal Reserve concerned that the impact to the economy of increasing capital requirements on financial institutions at a time when inflation remains persistently high would cause an issue?
So I think it's always a balance. We know that higher capital makes banks safer and sounder. We also know that you will at the margin provide less credit the more capital you have to have. But I think it's never exactly clear that you're at perfect equilibrium, and it's a fair question, I think, to look at that.
And I know out of respect for the chairman and trying to stay in my time, I will just
مرة
end by
تانية
saying,
بقولكم إذا
I
فيكم
heard
تعملوا
what you
لايك
said.
وسبسكرايب
Obviously, as you
للشانل
said, the
بكون
Federal
ممنونكم.
Reserve is not and will not be a climate policymaker. I just want to thank you for your public statement on that. I agree with you that there's a difference between policymakers and financial regulators, and certainly look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks, Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, it's good to see you again. Let me start by saying, depending on who's asking questions, we're either pounding you for how quickly we're going to drive that inflation back to 2%, or pounding you on making sure that we don't push the economy into a recession and drive up unemployment. I got to tell you, and it's these are maybe not the cheap seats, but I actually think you've done a pretty good job in terms of both ratcheting up rates and then starting to tail off a little bit. I think we all were
هلا
concerned
أنا
by the
حاسك إنك عم تعمل
January numbers
وظيفة
were
منيحة.
popped up a little bit more. I wish, Mr. Chairman, we're actually having this hearing 2 weeks from now because we're going to have a lot more data later in this week.
يا ريت بنعمل
But I want to
هالاجتماع بعد جمعتين، لأن حيصير عندنا معلومات أكثر،
ways to
أرقام
go, and the
التضخم
January
الجديدة رح
numbers were
تطلع.
concerning, but I do think your tailored approach, we can all second guess, but I think it has been the right approach. I'm going to commend you on that. I want to get 2 questions in. One of the areas that I am very worried about is commercial debt. I mean, we've got a Bloomberg story here showing, we're going to hit a $6 trillion wall this year on refinancing. Where I'm particularly concerned is the issue around commercial real estate. As we recover from COVID, a lot of things are getting back to normal, but clearly the transformation of where people work is going through a fundamental transition. And I hope people do return more to the office, but lots of folks prefer working elsewhere. That's going to fundamentally change the real estate market on the commercial side. And I do believe we're going to hit potentially a cliff here of a totally unexpected problem in terms of commercial real estate. How are you looking at that issue and recognizing there's lots of bumps coming out of COVID? This one seems to be more unique in nature.
الكوميرشال ريل استيت يعني مثل المعامل وهالامور رح يمكن ينخفض اسعارها. العالم كثير عم تشتغل صارت من بيوتها.
It's kind of been moving sideways as a percent of GDP, so you don't see a big spike going on or anything like that. However, of course, there are pockets of concern, and particularly you pointed to the refinancing spike that has to happen, and I've seen those come and go before. Generally, markets can absorb them, maybe at a much higher rate this time, but it's something that we're well aware of and watching carefully. In terms of CRE, I would agree with you. The occupancy of office space in many major cities is just remarkably low, and you wonder how that can be
المكاتب
over
كتير
time. Some of
منخفضة.
that's gonna
العالم
be
اللي عم
made
تستأجر
into
مكاتب كتير
condominiums and
منخفضة
things like that, since we
حاليا.
don't seem to
السبب
have affordable
بعد
housing
البانديميك العالم عم
in
تشتغل
some
من بيوتها
places.
وهالأمور.
But the
هل
question
عم
is,
تراقب
what's the financial
هالأمر أنت؟
stability
هل
risk?
هالشي معقول
It's
يهبط
not
الأسعار؟
great
عم
for
بيقول
the
له إيه،
largest
أنا بوافقك الرأي،
institutions. Don't
الأرقام
tend to have
كتير
a lot of
منخفضة.
direct exposure to that. Some smaller banks actually do. Medium and small size banks do. We carefully monitor it. We agree that that's an area that requires a lot of monitoring, and I'd say we're on the case. So,
Well, that will morph me into my last question, something we've talked about and a lot of my colleagues have talked about with the large institutions. I mean, I do think even some of the biggest critics of Dodd-Frank, I think, would acknowledge our banking system is a heck of a lot stronger and was able to withstand COVID in a very healthy way. But what we've also seen evolve is a vast amount of financial institutions move beyond the regulatory perimeter. The fact that we now have way over half of the mortgage origination coming from non-financing institutions, because a lot of the large entities, hedge funds, other funds, that may be doing some of this commercial debt or some of the CRE debt. I'd like you to talk generally in the last 40 seconds or so of how you think about this regulatory perimeter. I'm a big believer, and I know some of my colleagues are, that that we ought to look less at charter and look at same risk, same regulation, maybe as a guiding principle. And I know Senator Warren's been working on some work. I've been working on some work around crypto around that area. But there's a vast amount of activity that's taking place outside the regulatory perimeter. How should we be thinking about that, and how do we make sure that doesn't create the kind of crisis sneak up that happened in 2008 on the non-regulated side of the house?
I think you articulated the principle very well. It's same activity, same regulation, and that covers crypto and all kinds of other
القوانين
activities.
زادة على
People are
الجميع
going to
من
assume
كريبتو أو
when
من
they deal
غيره.
with something that looks like a money market fund that it has the same regulation as a money market fund or a bank deposit, and so stable coins need some attention in that respect.
العملات الثابتة لازم قوانين ثابتة.
And you're right. So much of intermediation has moved away from the regulated banks really for a long period of time. We got to keep an eye on that.
Thank you, Chair Powell.
We can keep looking at. I hope it's.
Thank you, Senator Vance. I'm sorry, Senator Haggerty of Tennessee.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, and thank you very much, Ranking Member Scott, for holding this hearing. Chairman, it's great to see you again here. I appreciate your presence, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about an item that I'm particularly concerned about, and that's the holistic review that Senator Britt just brought up that Vice Chair Bauer is conducting right now. It's generating a sense that higher capital requirements are on the horizon for us. And as I think about that in the context of what we've weathered, you think about the situation in 2020. It was an acute, real-life stress test, if you will. And I think that our financial system navigated that admirably. In the past, Chair Powell, you told this committee that our financial system has proven resilient through 2020, and that the capital levels at that point in time,
تاريخيا نظامنا المالي كان قوي وعم يقدر يقطع هالمصائب اللي عم تواجهها. بدنا نتأكد إذا أنت بعدك عم تفكر بنفس الموضوع.
In our system, we have a vice chair for supervision who has statutory responsibilities, and when a new vice chair for supervision comes in, generally they're going to want to take a fresh look. That's what the former one, Vice Chair Quarles did, and that's the
عم بيقول عنا عالم بيراقبوا هالأمور.
And that's what he did. So it's only natural that someone would come in and take a fresh look, and I think that's part of the process. The role of that person is to make recommendations on regulation and supervision to the full board. The role of the board is to consider those when made. And this, to me, this just
نحن دورنا نراقب هالأمور.
Well, as the review is underway, and I appreciate that context, one aspect of it seems to us as an apparent willingness to undo the tailoring requirements that were enacted as part of
كلهم كأنهم ضد زيادة الفوائد، عم بيقولوا لازم يكون تغيير بالسياسة الأساسية هي اللي بتأثر، مش بس زيادة الفوائد رح تهبط الأسعار. ما برأيهم كلهم هيك عم يحكوا مع بدهم اياه يطلع يقول هالشيء. هو ما راح يدخل بسجال سياسي، هو بده بيقول هيدي الادوات اللي عنا اياها لازم نستعملها. هن عم بيقولوا ليه ما نعمل تغيير سياسي بالسياسة النقدية تبع البلد يلي هي مش تحت سلطته جيروم باول. جيروم باول بده يسيطر على الفوائد، نغير بالسياسة النقدية وهالشي بيأثر.
If the proposal put forth by Vice Chair Barr is either unduly aggressive or appears to contradict the spirit of S2155, will you vote for it?
I can't answer that in the abstract, of course, but I would say we're, as an institution, very strongly committed to tailoring. And anything we do is going to reflect, tailoring of institutions according to their risk. And I mean, that's a principle that we'll stick with.
I think it's quite important, again, given the legislative intent here and the concerns that we maintain that in the face of what General Counsel said just yesterday. I appreciate your perspective in terms of keeping that in place. I'd like to come with my next question, Chairman Powell, with starting the question by underscoring the importance of the independence of the Fed's monetary policy. Right now, the economic picture is about as uncertain as I can remember. We've had large companies in the private sector who are in the midst of planning layoffs and forecasting serious economic weakness in the quarters to come. Yet, on the other hand, the current economic data seems to be robust. Inflation showed some signs of softening in the past several releases. So I just hope, Chair Powell, that you could briefly tell us how you synthesize these seemingly contradictory data.
So just quickly, at the end of last year, we saw a couple of very promising, modest inflationary readings in November and December. But earlier this year, some of that improvement was revised away. In addition, we got a very strong reading on inflation in January, also a very strong jobs reading, also very strong retail sales. And so, as I pointed out in my testimony, we're looking at a reversal, really, of what we thought we were seeing to some extent, a partial reversal. It's still true. It's still the case that we're seeing progress on inflation. We're seeing goods inflation has come down significantly. There's improvement in housing inflation in the pipeline. There's not a lot of improvement yet to be seen in the largest sector, which is non-housing services. So inflation's running at core inflation's running at 4.7% on a 12-month basis. I think nothing about the data suggests to me that we've tightened too much. Indeed, it suggests that we still have work to do.
كل شيء هيدي خبر، هيدي سلبي اللي قاله هلا سلبي جيروم باول قال. شفنا انخفاض بالتضخم بكثير من الامور. التضخم شفنا انخفاض، ولكن ما شفنا بعدنا بمراحل بعيده عن وين ما بدنا. ما شفنا شيء من السياسه اللي عملناها عم بتاثر على الاقتصاد لدرجه بتخلينا نفكر. بعد عنا شغل بدنا نعمل، يعني السياسه رح تكمل. هذا اللي قال هون، هذا السلبيه فيها.
And as I indicated in my testimony, I think that the data we've seen so far, and we still have other data to see, we still have significant data to see before the meeting, suggests that the ultimate rate that we write down may well be higher than what we wrote down in December.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
كله لتحكي هيدي.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
هيدي
So the
شايفينها
Fed
هالي
has
هون.
raised interest rates
يلا
8
عن
times over the
شكلك.
last year in what has been the most extreme
ما في قد
rate
بكره على
hike
هيدي.
cycle in
هيدي
40
إليزابيث
years.
وارن.
The Fed's goal is to slow inflation, and your tool, raising interest rates, is designed to slow
هيدي
the
ضد كريبتو
economy
بشكل
and
عام،
throw people out
دائما
of work.
سلبية.
So
هيدي
far, you haven't tipped the economy into recession, but you haven't brought inflation entirely under control either. And maybe the reason for that is that other things are also keeping prices high, things you can't fix with high interest rates, things like price gouging and supply chain kinks and a war in Ukraine. But you are determined to continue to raise interest rates, so I want to take a look at where you're headed. In December, the Fed released its projections on the state of the economy under your monetary policy plan. According to the Fed's own report, if you continue raising interest rates as you plan, unemployment will be 4.6% by the end of the year, more than a full point higher than it is today. Chair Powell, if
بنهاية
you
السنة
hit your
بدها تزيد
projections,
البطالة
do you know how
بنسبة
many
1%.
people who are currently working, going about their lives, will lose their jobs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I will say it's not
it's
an
just a math
intended
problem.
consequence. It's
Well,
not.
but it is, and it's in your report, and that would be about 2 million people who would lose their jobs. People who are working right now, making their mortgages. So Chair Powell, if you could speak directly to the 2 million hardworking people who have decent jobs today, who you're planning to get fired over the next year.
عم تقول له
What would
انت
you say
خطتك
to them?
تخلي
How
العالم
would you
تخسر
explain to them
وظائفها.
that they need to
قال له
do
انا
some
مش
things?
هدفي خسر
I would
الوظائف.
explain to people more broadly that inflation is extremely high and it's hurting the working people of this country badly. All of them, not just 2 million of them, but all of them are suffering under high inflation, and we are taking
أنا هدفي كل البلد
the only
وكلهم عم
measures we
يعانوا من
have
هالأمر مش
to
إذا
bring
زادت
inflation down.
البطالة بالنسبة.
Putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost. And they
اعمل لي
just have
دعاية
to work.
لحالك لحتى ترجعي ينتخبوك.
Will working people be better off if we just walk away from our jobs and inflation
Well,
remains 5
برافو
6%?
عليك.
Let me
برافو
ask
على
you about what happens if you do this. Since the end of World War II, there have been 12 times in which the unemployment rate has increased by 1 percentage point within 1 year, exactly what you're aiming to do right now. How many of those times did the U.S. economy avoid falling into a recession?
You know, it's not as black and white as very,
Just
very
looking at the
infrequent.
numbers, it actually is pretty black
Alan
and white.
Blinder's written a book on this, and
There have been 12 times that we've seen a 1-point increase in the unemployment rate in a year. That's exactly what your Fed report has put out as the projection and the plan based on how you're going to keep raising these interest rates. How many times did the economy fail to fall into a
عم
recession
بتقول هي
after
إنه
doing that?
إذا
Out of 12
عم
times.
بتكفي تاريخيا وقت تزيد الفوائد هيك بدخلنا على ركود
So
اقتصادي.
then the question becomes, we've got 2 million people out of work. Can you stop it at 2 million people? History suggests that the Fed has a terrible track record of containing modest increases in the
أنت شو
unemployment
عملت
rate.
أنت طيب؟
Once the economy starts shedding jobs, it's kind of like a runaway train. It is really hard to stop. In fact, in 11 out of the 12 times that the unemployment rate increased by a full percentage point within 1 year, unemployment went on to rise another full percentage point on top of that. If that's what happens this time, we'd be looking at least 3.5 million people who would lose their jobs.
إذا البطالة
Chair
زادت
Powell,
2% عم
if you
نطلع على
reach your
4
goal
مليون
and 2
أشخاص
million people get
يخسروا
laid off by
وظائفهم
the end of this
تقريبا.
year, and then just like in 11 out of
مليونين
12
هالسنة
times
ومليونين
that
السنة اللي جاية.
unemployment has risen by a point in a single year, it keeps on rising. And then we've got 2.5 million people out of work. We've got 3 million people who get laid off. We've got 3.5 million people who get laid off. What's your plan?
Well, right now the unemployment rate is 3.4%, which is the lowest in 54 years. And we actually don't think that we need to see a sharp or enormous increase in unemployment to get inflation under control.
I'm looking at your projections. Do you call laying off 2 million people this year not a sharp increase in
I would say
unemployment?
4.5%.
Explain that to the 2 million families who are going to be out of work.
We're not targeting any of that. But I would say even 4.5% unemployment is well better than most of the time for the last 75 years.
In other words, you don't have a plan to stop a runaway train if it occurs. Chair Powell, you are gambling with people's lives, and there's a pile of data showing the price gouging and supply chain hits and the war in Ukraine are driving up prices. You cling to the idea that there's only one solution: lay off millions of workers. We need a Fed that will fight for families, and if you're not going to lead that charge, we need someone at the Fed who will.
Senator Vance of Ohio.
يا حدا عم بيقول لي هي عم تحكي الحقيقة. أنا معك، هي عم تحكي الحقيقة. هي عم تحكي الحقيقة، ولكن بنفس الوقت المشكلة الأساسية مش الفيدرالي، المشكلة الأساسية سياسة الدولة هي المشكلة الأساسية. ما فيها تحط كل التهم عليه وحده. أنا ماني عم دافع عنه، ما بيهمني لا هو ولا غيره يعني. ولكن عم تتهمه هي سياستها، سياسة فريق العمل اللي معه هو اللي أثر بشكل كتير كبير على الجزء. وما فيها كل المشاكل اللي عملوها تحطهم عليها. أنا ما بحبها لأنه من أقرب مواقفها بالكريبتو يعني صراحة، مشان هيك ما بحبها لإليزابيث وارن. بس عم بحكيكم بشكل عام، هون ما فيها تكون عم تحكي معه بهالطريقة كأنه هو السبب الأساسي. ليه ما بتحكي مع بايدن هيك؟ ليه ما بتحكي مع السياسات اللي عملوها بايدن اللي أثرت على الأمر؟ هيك هذا اللي عم أقوله أنا بس.
I'm wondering when I hear about the history, when I think about and read about the history of Appalachia and the resource curse, I'm struck by some of the
هيدي منيحة،
by
هيدي
the idea
بتدعم
that you could make
الكريبتو.
a similar argument about the reserve currency status of the United States dollar. Americans have enjoyed one of the greatest privileges of the international economy for the last nearly 8 decades, a strong dollar that acts, of course, as the world's reserve currency. You know that better than I do. Now, this has obviously been great for American purchasing power. We enjoy cheaper imports. Americans, when they travel abroad, benefit from lower costs. But it does come at a cost to American producers. I think in some ways you can argue that the reserve currency status is a massive subsidy to American consumers, but a massive tax on American producers. Now, I know the strong dollar is sort of a sacred cow of the Washington consensus, but when I survey the American economy and I see our mass consumption of mostly useless imports on the one hand and our hollowed out industrial base on the other hand, I wonder if the reserve currency status also has some downsides and not just some upsides as well. And let me just put a final point on this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that, Chairman Powell. We're, of course, now the main supporter of a massive land war in Europe between the Russians and the Ukrainians. I read recently, and I'm not going to comment on how perfect or precise these estimates are, but I read recently that the United States is trying to ramp up production from 14,000 artillery shells to 20,000 artillery shells. That's per month, while the Russians are firing 20,000 artillery shells in Ukraine per day. And when I look at the American economy, we have a lot of financial engineers and a lot of diversity consultants. We don't have a lot of people making things. And I worry that the reserve currency status and the lack of control we have over our currency is perhaps driving that. I'd love to get your feedback on that. What are the upsides and downsides of the reserve currency?
That's a big question to try to answer.
You have 2 minutes, today. Chairman Powell, so plenty of time.
I can't even get started on that. So we are the world's reserve currency, of course.
نحن العملة العالمية الدولار.
It's because of our control over inflation over many years. The world trusts the rule of law in the United States, and those are the things. So once you're the world's reserve currency, it's used in all over the world in transactions, and it's the place where people want to be in times of stress is in dollar denominated.
نحن بما انه العملة الريزيرف بالعالم، العملة العالمية هي الدولار هو وين العالم بدها تكون. العالم تنقل عملتها على الدولار وقت يكون في اي أزمة ثقة.
That's an advantage. There's some economic theory around that it also has burdens of various kind, but I can't call it all back to mind. But the other thing is, it's a very stable equilibrium, but it's not a perfect one. It's not a permanent one, rather. So there isn't any obvious candidate to replace the United States right now, where you can have free flow of capital in and out of the country, where you can really trust the rule of law and democratic institutions, and keeping price stability, which you can here.
Do you think it gives us less control over our own currency, the fact that it's become the world's reserve currency?
Control over our currency. I'm not sure. So essentially, what we try to control is price stability, and no, it doesn't. It doesn't make it harder for us to keep inflation control. The United States has a smaller external sector than most large economies, where it's only about 15%. So mainly, what affects inflation in the United States is domestic supply and demand.
Do you think it makes it harder for us to affect and to fight back against currency manipulation, to control the export and import flows in a way that stabilizes our own manufacturing sector?
Well, I mean, what's important there is really the level of the dollar, and when the dollar is stronger, obviously our wares are more expensive abroad and that kind of thing. But we don't have an opinion on. Matters of the level of the dollar really matters for the Treasury Department and the elected government, not for the Fed.
Thank you, Chairman Powell.
Thank you.
Thanks in advance, Senator Van Hollen of Maryland.
ما في شيء ما يحكي عن
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, thank you for being here and for your service. I know the Fed is experiencing lots of challenges these days. I've got a couple questions that
كم
are
واحد
just,
بده
I think,
يحكي؟
basic yes or no's, and then some longer questions. Would you agree that changes in the size of corporate profits can be one of the factors that affects the inflation rate?
Yes.
Right. Now, recently, we saw that the employment cost index, which, as you know, measures the growth of wages and benefit costs, grew at roughly 4% on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter of 2022. Is that right?
That's my recollection. Yes.
So if
يسيطروا على
corporate
العملات
profits
المستقرة.
were to decline from the extremely high levels that we saw recently, would it be possible to sustain the 4% growth rate in the employment cost index for an extended period of time, even as we get inflation down to the target of 2%?
Depends on what you mean by extended period of time. So you would not, without a very, very large increase in productivity, which would be great, but that we don't expect, you wouldn't be able to sustain 4% wage inflation over the longer term. Over the shorter term, though, yes.
So over the shorter term, that would not be a justification in and of itself for raising rates. Is that right, in the short term?
Well, I think wages affect prices and prices affect wages. I think we do think
المعاشات
some
الأسعار
softening of
بتأثر على
labor market
المعاشات
conditions
والمعاشات بتأثر على الأسعار.
will happen
إذا انخفضت اليد البطالة ارتفعت شوي صغيرة هالشيء رح يأثر على الأسعار بشكل أو بآخر.
Are you saying that simply looking at the current 4% growth rate in the short term is an excuse for jacking up interest rates?
I think what I would say is that the overall, all the data we look at,
كل المعطيات اللي عندي إياها
not just that measure of wage,
مش بس هذا اللي عم تحكي عنه.
Unemployment, also participation, also job openings and quits and things like that. All of that, you put that into the picture, and I think you see a labor market that is extremely tight and is probably contributing to inflation. I've never said it was the main cause.
I think the larger point here, based on your response to that first question about growth in profits, is corporations have a decision as to whether or not they're going to pocket more for profit, which they can.
هي الشركات الأساس إنه عم بيحطوا كثير من الأرباح بجيبهم.
And if you actually lowered your profit margins, you could sustain a higher wage increase without violating the 2% inflation. Isn't that right?
Yes. I mean, when I hear profit margins, what we're seeing in the economy is pretty much about shortages and supply chain blockages. And when there's not enough of a product, what happens, and there's a lot of demand, what you see is prices going up as the supply chains get fixed and shortages are alleviated. You will see prices, inflation coming down. You'll see margins.
المشكلة من السبلاي تشين. السبلاي تشين هي
margin, right? They're going up.
البضائع اللي عم يقدروا يجيبوها ويودوها كان في قلة من هالبضائع. هالشيء بيؤدي للأسعار تطلع. وقت يمشي حال يبطل في مشاكل ورا الصين ولا غيرهم، هالشيء وحده رح يهبط الأسعار كمان.
In response to the first question, let me ask you about the tight labor market, because one of the issues in the tight labor market is parents with kids, including a lot of moms who would like to go back into the market, but are not able to do so because of lack of affordable childcare. The other issue is immigration, and I know that you've gotten some recent data on how some immigration figures actually have softened a little bit the tightness in the labor market. Can you just talk broadly about those two factors, affordable childcare and immigration, more legal immigration, and how they could affect labor force participation and therefore also reduce inflation pressures?
So on the first, we don't make recommendations or evaluate fiscal policy, but I will say there's research that shows that it helps keep women in the workforce when there's childcare available, which is kind of self-evident. Sorry, the second was
impact of immigration.
Yeah. So what I talked about with you is actually as part of the January Bureau of Labor Statistics report, which comes the employment report for January, which comes out in early February. There is a section in there about more people. The Census Department has increased its estimate of the workforce by something like 870,000. And a significant part of that has been immigration. So, and that has moved up participation by a little bit, but, and it may be part of why we're hearing, it may be part of why we're hearing from, in the labor market that the really intense labor shortage pressures that we were hearing about in 2021 and 22 may be alleviating. So that would contribute to that. Clearly, more people, clearly the economy is
شباب
calling
بتمنى
for more
تعملوا
people
لايك
with essentially
للستريم
2 job
للعالم
openings
تعرف.
for every unemployed person. And this can be a source of those people.
Right. And that would reduce the tightness of the labor market and reduce pressures on inflation, right?
May already be doing so.
Thank you.
Senator Kramer of North Dakota is
يلي
recognized.
ملحق وعم بيحققوا معه كل شخص عم يسأله سؤال بس هو واقف أرضه. هيدي الأدوات اللي عنا إياها بس ملخص سريع يعني. هالأدوات اللي عنا إياها بدنا نتحكم بالتضخم على عبارة خلال هالأمور. الأمور اللي عنا إياها أكتريتهم عم يحكوا إنه مش التضخم مش بس بيتسيطر عليه من ناحية الفوائد، في قوانين وسياسات لازم تتبعها الدولة الأمريكية. هذا الملخص بشكل سريع بس عم يحققوا معه كأنه عنده شرطة.
Chairman Brown said we should rebuild our supply chain by curbing offshoring, corporate offshoring. I agree. He talked a lot about corporate greed contributing to inflation. Okay. But how about regulatory greed contributing to corporate greed? How do you expect corporations to reinvest money if you overregulate their ability to invest that money right here in the United States of America? You want to onshore some things? How about energy policy? How about instead of looking to Venezuela or Iran for oil supply or Russia, or rather than looking to China for electric vehicles and chips and solar panels, how about we have a strategy that onshores those things by reducing regulation, reducing taxes, letting those corporations reinvest their profits rather than stock
لا ما
buybacks
خص الفيدرالي فيها هيدي هالسياسة. وعم بيقولوا ليستثمروا بالبلد ويخلوا الامور تصير بقلب البلد بدل ما يسفروها ويخفوا القوانين. هيدي بتساهم بتخفيض التضخم. هيدي مش لجيروم باول.
You don't like to comment on policy. You and I have been around and around about this. You were anxious to advise us to spend lots of money during the pandemic. I don't think a lot of people blame you for that. You wouldn't respond to efforts by the Biden administration after we were in a robust recovery from not spending so much money. Okay, I can appreciate the change. But now we're in this debate between Republicans and Democrats, between particularly the House Speaker and the President, on how to raise the debt ceiling. And you've made some pretty strong comments about raising the debt ceiling, absent from structural reforms that would actually help us get back to a reasonable growth. And so I warn you again, if you're going to make political comments, if you're going to advise us on policy, be consistent with it. Now, I want to get back to the greening of the Federal Reserve and these, I call them stress tests. You can call them whatever we call them. But I'm concerned that now the Federal Reserve is starting down this path. Maybe it's slightly at first about climate stress testing. I just want to ask you this. If we're going to go down that path, if the Federal Reserve is now going to become part of the Federal Climate Police Force, are we going to consider the ramifications of having entire communities and economies, factories and manufacturers, whatever energy entities, large server farms, leaving them susceptible to a very unreliable, very expensive energy source? Is that part of the stress test?
No, those are considerations for elected people, not for us. We have a narrow role to play here, but it's a real role, and I can talk about
هدول منن هموم عنا اياهم. هول العالم اللي بيتم انتخابهم. نحن ما بيهمنا هلا، نحن هدفنا عنا عمل معين ولازم نعمله اللي هو التضخم.
Related to climate, which really is more weather than climate. Then are we going to consider the effects of an unreliable energy source at several locations throughout our country?
So our only focus is on the safety and soundness of these institutions, and do they understand and can they manage all of the risks that they run in their business model? That's our only goal. We're not looking to be climate policymakers. policy is clearly going to have effects on regions, on companies, on individuals, on countries, disparate effects. And, that is not for
شباب ما
unelected
تزعلوا إذا ما عم جاوب على الأسئلة،
like
ما
us.
بقدر
And
أركز
Jerome,
على الأسئلة
it
وترجم اللي
does
عم
touch
بيصير، ضروري
climate
بدي أركز على شو عم بيصير
you're
حكي
right to be
لترجم
concerned
للجميع.
that
عفوا يعني.
that we find ourselves on a slippery slope. But honestly, I think the climate scenarios are something that the
إيه
banks are
معك،
already
أنا
doing
كنت الفيدرالي
themselves.
لتنظيم المال، بس عم
And,
يسألوه
and
أسئلة
the
اقتصادية
climate guidance
وسياسية
is something
حاليا.
that they're looking for. They want to know how we're thinking about this, but we will try really hard not to get on a slippery slope and find ourselves becoming climate policymakers. It's just not appropriate
Well,
for an independent agency.
Okay, and I completely agree, and I hope you stick to that. And I think you ought to, ask the banks to consider what the overreaction might, what kind of vulnerabilities that might expose. With that, with regard to what Senator Warren was saying on her monologue, one thing about ideologues, they have the luxury of binary choices. You have a really big job, and you have a single, in my mind, one and a half, maybe two missions. I think the first one handles the second one okay, but it's got to be tough when the White House is working against you and you don't have to comment. Thank you.
حلوة هيدي. قال له عندك وظيفة واحدة أنت أو اثنين لتعملهم، وكتير صعبة إنه وقت يكون البيت الأبيض عم يشتغل ضدك، إنه كيف جو بايدن عم يصرف بلا وعي، عم يبعت أموال، عم يعمل. حلو. قال له مش مضطر تعلق على الموضوع. ضحكني.
Right now, cannot overstate the importance of the Fed's independence. I said it in the previous administration. I say it now. We cannot be playing politics with our economy. And that is a fact. From a climate standpoint, I would just tell you it's entirely artificial right now anyway, because if you look at the hundreds of billions of dollars this country puts out every year in disasters due to climate instability, we ought to be asking our question, is that sustainable? Because quite frankly, it has to be done, and I don't think it's sustainable. So we've got to start looking for some solutions on the climate side sooner rather than later. The Reserve has a tough job, and I really appreciate how you've done it. Reasonable, working together, making hard decisions for the good of the economy. We have to get this right. So the question is, how much has inflation decreased since its peak?
قدين خفض
It depends
التضخم
on the
من
measure, but it's
قمة.
meaningfully, at least a couple percentage points.
Okay, and has unemployment gone down as inflation has gone down?
هل انخفضت البطالة مع التضخم؟
To now a 54-year low.
Yes. So the question becomes, and I always think back to in 1998, I bought some property, and the interest on that property was 10% in 1998, and I thought I got a hell of a deal. By the way, I thought it was just great. But the truth is interest rates have been artificially low for the last 20 years, probably. And the question becomes, as you look at the economy and as you try to make the determination whether the inflation is caused by demand or supply, where does all that fall in to your decision making moving forward?
Well, you mean the level of interest rates? So in theory, there's this thing called the neutral level of interest, and we know it only by its works. And neutral is the level that neither pushes the economy up nor pulls it down. And it changes over time. This is the thing about these important variables in economics. So what's happened until now was that the neutral level of interest went down and down and down to the point where, many countries had zero interest rates and very low inflation. Now we have this series of shocks associated with the pandemic, and we have rates at 4.5%, our policy rate, and we have the labor market very strong and inflation reacting somewhat, and it does raise the question of where's the neutral rate. Honestly, we don't know. I think we look at the current situation and we see that there's not a lot of evidence that, hard to make a case that we've over tightened. It means we need to continue to tighten. I think we're very mindful of the lags with which our policy works. We don't think we need a significant increase in unemployment, and we're certainly not aiming for one. But we do think there'll be some softening in labor market conditions to get to 2% inflation.
When you're looking at interest rates, I know we talk about energy prices here and the price of gasoline, and then if you go over and Europe is much, much higher. Are we comparable? I'm just curious. Are we comparable with our interest rates here as with, say, Europe?
We're very close to where Canada is. We're a little bit higher than where Europe is. Europe's traditionally had much lower inflation. They now have very high inflation, and they're still increasing rates, but they're a bit lower in terms of rates.
So if we do not get the inflation under control, and like I
إذا
said,
ما
I
قدرنا
think the
نسيطر على
steps you've
التضخم
taken have been reasonable and measured. If we don't get it under control, what is that really? What are the impacts of that?
شو راح يكون تأثير
Well,
هذا الوضع؟
the social costs of failure is one way to think about it, are very, very high. So if inflation were to continue, at some point that will become the psychology. People will come and businesses will come to expect high inflation, and that will make it more self-perpetuating. That will mean an up and down economy. It'll mean, it'll mean something that looks more like what we've seen in periods of high inflation. Capital allocation is difficult in a world like that. It's not a good time for the economy. What we want to do is restore price stability.
ما قدرنا بيأثر كتير بيصير في صعود وهبوط
so that we can have the
بالأسعار
kind of strong labor market
بالاقتصاد
for
ما بيعود
sustained
في
period
ثقة
that we had
بالوضع.
before.
Once again, thank you for your work. Thank you for your independence. Senator Daines.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tester. I'll be handing off to Senator Cortez Masto when I'm finished up as well. So, Mr. Chairman, good to have you here today. When I am back in Montana, the number one issue I hear, certainly across the state, is the high cost of gas, the high cost of groceries, and overall how their paychecks are shrinking because of inflation. It's a crushing blow. It has real life impacts. It's top of mind issue for Montanans. It's also important to note the devastating impact it's going to have on our nation's economic future. In fact, in October of last year, I sent a letter to Congressional Budget Office Director Swagel regarding the impact that high inflation and the
ما
elevated
بيعطي جواب
interest
كامل
rates
باول
would have
لأنه
on the
في أمور
cost of
منا
servicing
بيسلطوا هن بدهم إياه يجاوب سياسي هو ما بيجاوب
His
سياسي يعني
response
هن
made
عم
it a
يشتغلوا
less than
سياسي
rosy
كمان يعني.
picture. But then we got the CBO's updated 10-year baseline forecast in February, and it confirmed the truly dire situation that we find ourselves in. Driven by interest payments on the debt, the CBO now projects that cumulative deficits during the 10-year window, and I recognize where deficits come from. It's irresponsible spending here in Washington, but the cumulative deficits during the 10-year window will exceed $20 trillion. The cumulative deficits, not talking the debt, because it's going to grow the total federal debt to more than $51 trillion by 2033. Now, 2033 used to sound like a long ways away. We're 10 years away. 10 years goes by very, very quickly. Within 5 years, we're going to spend more on annual interest on the national debt than we spend on national defense. Think about that for a moment. And these are coming out of the CBO. These absolutely shocking, but quite frankly, predictable projections go back to a debate we vigorously had here in the banking committee. I remember when Lawrence Summers, of course, former Secretary of Treasury under President Clinton, economic advisor to President Obama, he warned us. He said, he was practically warning my colleagues across the aisle, says you can't move forward with these purely partisan, at that time, a $1.9 trillion spending extravaganza. We had $1 trillion of unspent COVID money in December of 2020. And that passed on a purely partisan vote. We said it's going to start to ignite the inflation fires. So I certainly hope the president's budget, which we expect to see later this week, will propose pro-growth policies that can get us out of this mess. And I would argue almost an existential crisis as we look at what's going to come at us here over the course of the next 10 years with debt and service on that debt. Unfortunately, as the president said in the State of the Union address, the president says he's going to raise taxes. That's a recipe for disaster. It's going to crush productivity, discourage investment, stifle economic growth even further. I want to turn to my questions now, Chairman Powell. You're raising interest rates to combat the inflation we've seen in the economy over the past few years. Is that correct?
Yes.
And although this is the domain of Treasury, a higher Fed's fund rate will mean higher borrowing costs. Is that correct?
Yes, all else equal.
So I just want to connect the dots here around inflation was sparked. One of the big reasons was massive spending here in Washington. And now we're going to be bearing the challenges with higher debt service over the course of the next several years, where we're going to see debt service exceeding defense spending, which is we see the threats of China, threats around the world. I think it's very, very concerning. Now, as a grandfather of 4, soon to be 5 grandchildren, this is things you think about more and more as you look forward. I want to change here and talk about American energy. When the war in Ukraine broke out, many feared that Russia would cut off natural gas exports and cause energy inflation to spike. Prices didn't spike as much as anticipated, due in large part to the fact that American companies stepped up to the plate. As of late last year, the European Union now receives more liquefied natural gas from the United States producers than it does from Russian producers. That's a good thing for the world to see more U.S. produced energy. Chairman Powell, do you believe that European and American inflation would have been manageable if not for American energy producers?
I certainly think that particularly our natural gas assets have helped Europe make the transition.
Any sense of how much worse the global energy picture would be if you would imagine a world where we're not producing and shipping energy to other countries?
It'd be hard to estimate.
Probably worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been clearly Europe has managed better than expected, and a part of that story is just U.S.
عم بيحكوا عن انه كيف امريكا عم بتودي غاز لاوروبا، وهالشيء ساهم بتقوية اوروبية وتخفيض التضخم. عم بيسألوا اذا ما عملنا هيك بتعرف شو كنا عملنا؟ شو كنا لو ما بعتنا الغاز لاوروبا، تعرف كان اكيد الوضع كان اسوء. يعني عم بفرجي انه عم بيصير
here on the committee. I want to first align myself with the remarks from Chairman Menendez supporting a Latino nominee to the open seat on the Federal Reserve. It's been more than 100 years, and a Latino has never served on the Federal Reserve Board. And I know there are many strong Latino economists and economic experts who would capably serve. So I want to put that out there. Chairman Powell, I also sit on Senate Finance. Right across the way, we were talking about affordable housing.
ما في شيء مهم مثل هيك ما كنت عم ترجم صراحة.
So many of us across the country, including in Nevada, when we talk about affordable housing, it's also about workforce housing. It's about making sure families that are working so hard have an opportunity to keep a roof over their head. Right now in Nevada, if you're making minimum wage, you have to work 75 hours a week just to be able to afford housing. And so I want to talk to you about this. I was distressed to see in the report that that activity in the housing sector
عم تحكي عن البيوت وتأثيرها بمناطق معينة بأمريكا إذا ما عم يشتغلوا كميات كتير من الأوقات، إذا بحد الأدنى للأجور ما عم يقدروا يدفعوا أجار البيت بسبب التضخم وأسعار الفايدة. هيك عم تحكي.
Between keeping interest rates low to spur that affordable home building and home buying while addressing inflation.
We have a dual mandate from Congress, as you well know, which is maximum employment and price stability. And that's really what we take into account.
بحسب الكونغرس هدفنا البرايس ستابيليتي، ثبات الاسعار، يعني هو لجنة التضخم والارقام البطاله. الارقام البطاله اوطى نسبه بطاله بتاريخ امريكا حاليا، والتضخم عم نحاول نرجمه.
That's not a choice that we make. That's just the way it works, and we only have really one tool, which is monetary policy. So
والأداة الوحيدة اللي عندنا هي السياسة النقدية يلي هي زيادة الفوائد.
But really just to achieve our statutory goals.
It happens to just unfortunately be in effect as you try to achieve your statutory goal. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I want to have you have the opportunity to address Senator Warren's conversation with you earlier about the tools that you have and the impact that it has on causing potentially more people to be unemployed, and this obviously has an impact on their ability to afford homes as well. Can you address that?
I'd be glad to. I want to be clear that we do not seek, and we don't believe we need to have a very significant downturn in the labor market. And it's not just hope. I think if you look at the situation in the labor market, you've got all these job openings, and in principle, you could reduce the job openings without seeing a really significant increase in unemployment. Also, you're starting from such a strong labor market. It seems as though you're a long way away from anything that looks like a recession, just looking at the labor market by itself. So honestly, we don't know that we need that there will need to be a really significant downturn. Other business cycles had quite different backstories than this one, and we're going to have to find out whether that matters or not. But I do think that I've said all along, and my colleagues and I have too, that we believe that there's a path to restoring 2% inflation with less significant effects on the labor market than have typically been seen in downturns.
And for purposes of the general public, people, Nevadans that I know that are struggling, we have one of the highest, we've talked about this, and thank you for always
شكرا يوسف.
being willing to talk with me. We have one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. Our service sector was hit so hard. We're still at over 5% just in Southern Nevada. We have high gas prices. We have grocery prices. We have housing prices that are high. So one of the things that you have commented on, and you just did again, but I know it was in your opening remarks that, and it's quoted right here, and let me just say, our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. For the general public,
هو عم بيقول انه هو معقول كتير يوصل التضخم ل 2% بغض النظر عن حال شيء، ومع عدم تأثير بالبطالة بشكل كبير. هو ما هدفه تأثير البطالة، هو هدفه يلجم التضخم، هذا الهدف الأساسي، وبده يترك الانemployment واطي قد ما فيه. ولكن إذا عليت شوي على الأرقام هي منا هالمشكلة كبيرة.
It's not obvious how that is, but what 2% inflation, to have people believe that inflation is going to go back to 2% really anchors inflation there, because the evidence is and the modern belief is that people's expectations about inflation actually have an effect on inflation. If you expect inflation to go up 5%, then it will. If everyone kind of expects that, because that's what businesses and households will be expecting, and it'll kind of happen because they expect it. So having a 2% inflation goal, which we had for many years, de facto we had it, then we formally adopted it in 2012. But for years before that, we were effectively targeting 2% inflation. And what that meant was that inflation, it's one of the reasons why inflation was low and predictable, is having a real target and sticking to it, not changing it, at convenient moments. So we think it's really important that we do stick to a 2% inflation target and not consider changing it. We're not going to do that. It just is. People will be better off.
شربي باول عم بيأثر كتير على الوضع العالمي، ولكن المشكلة مش بس هو السياسات اللي عم يتبعها بايدن وسياسات الإدارة الأمريكية أضرب منه. هو عم بيجرب بالأدوات اللي عنده إياها يسيطر على التضخم، بينما السياسات هي الأساس. السياسات السلبية اللي عم تتبعها الدولة الأمريكية بشكل عام.
Seeking that 2% magic number. Are you
هيدي أنا سناتور لومس، هيدي الداعمة للكريبتو، بحبها هيدي أنا.
cost of borrowing for the United States, knowing that Congress has over borrowed and that we have overspent and that the national debt is at now at least 97% of GDP, and that we're going to face challenges of our own making. This is not about what the Fed has done. This is what about the Congress has done that you have to factor in.
الحق على الكونغرس، هذا اللي عم بتقوله.
The costs of borrowing for the United States itself.
100% إذا رجع ترامب يا شربي. رجل اقتصاد على القليلة، مش مثل بايدن.
Constrained in our monetary policy by the budgetary situation of the United States, and we're not. We're clearly not. The path we're on is not sustainable, but the level of debt that we have is not unsustainable. Is sustainable. Put it that way. So we don't think about about interest costs when we make monetary policy. We think about maximum employment and price stability.
It's your opinion that the level of debt we have is sustainable?
Yes, I mean, we could clearly we have the the largest economy in the world. We can service this debt. That's not the problem. The problem is that we're on a path where the debt is growing substantially faster than the economy, and that's kind of by definition, in the long run, unsustainable. And the way countries have gotten fixed that is with longer term programs that have bipartisan support and that address the actual problem in the budget. That's really the formula.
Thank you. I'm going to switch to stable coins. You're a member of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets. The working group called for bank-like regulation of stable coins in late 2021. Then on January 3rd of this year, in a joint staff statement, the federal banking agencies stated that even after the bank's capital, BSA, AML, and risk management, a bank issuing a stable coin on a quote open, public, or decentralized network is highly likely to be inconsistent with safe and sound banking practices. I'm going to say that again. Even after a bank's capital, BSA, AML, and risk management, a bank issuing a stable coin on an open, public, or decentralized network is highly likely to be inconsistent with safe and sound banking practices. So I'm a little confused about where we're heading on stable coins. Does the January 3rd statement mean that the Fed has decided that stable coins on a permissionless distributed ledger have no place in banks?
So I think that there are real concerns about permissionless public blockchains, and the reason is that they've been so susceptible to fraud, to money laundering, and all of those things. So I think what you heard from the federal banking agencies in one of their reports was that they would tend to look at those as not consistent with safety and soundness.
And what about properly regulated stable coins? Do you think they could have a place in our banking system?
I certainly think that in a world of appropriate regulation, where the same activity, where stablecoin activity gets the same regulation as comparable products in different places, then there certainly could be a place for stablecoins in our financial services sector.
The European Union, UK, Australia, Switzerland, Singapore, and others have all moved over the last few years to create a legislative framework for digital assets. The European Union in particular is attempting to be a standard setter again, like it was with its data protection rule. Is the United States in danger of being a rule taker, not a rule maker when it comes to digital assets?
I do think it would be important for us to have a workable legal framework around digital activities. I think that is
ضروري يكون عندنا قوانين واضحة عن العملات الرقمية لحتى ما نوقع بيهايند، يعني ما نتأخر عن التأقلم مع الوضع لأنه كثير بدنا عم يسمعونا.
One area we've already seen is in the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision. They propose prudential treatment for crypto assets framework, setting forth banks' capital standards for digital assets. The Basel Committee's framework does not impose a capital charge for digital asset custody, whereas the SEC's Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 imposes a prohibitive capital charge through the back door and places consumers at risk in bankruptcy. Similarly, the Basel Committee framework allows banks to issue or hold digital assets on their balance sheet if the requisite capital is set aside. So back to January 3rd, 23, the Fed and other bank regulators have said that it is forbidden for a U.S. bank to conduct these activities no matter the capital. So my question is, what does the rest of the world know about digital asset regulation that we do not?
شو بقية العالم عم يعملوا قوانين، ليه نحن ما بنعرف شو عم نعمل
As
القوانين؟
we discussed, this is an SEC staff accounting bulletin, and it's not something that the Fed issued, and I'd be loath to
هذا الأمر تم إطلاقه من ال SEC.
the issue is, and what concerns me is that the Fed and other federal banking agencies are not following international norms on digital asset regulation. That's just my comment. Thank you, Chairman Powell,
لطشت
for being here.
لجاري جانسلر.
I
هلا بدي
now
في كم جواب
recognize Senator Smith.
كم جواب طلعوا بدي اسالهم. احد الاشخاص عم بيقول لي عن العملات المستقره انه امريكا عم تحاربهم. مثل ما قال هو لا بده قوانين واضحه على الميلتين لا يطلعوا، بدهم عملتهم الثابته هن عمله ثابته للبنك المركزي. لذلك ما رح مجرد طلعوا القوانين هلا ولا بعدين رح ياثروا على المدى القصير عن القوانين تبع العملات المستقره، ولكن مجرد يطلعوا هالشيء رح يكون ايجابي ليه، لانه رح نشوف دخول اموال كبيره من شركات كبيره على المجال. على المدى البعيد شيء ايجابي، على المدى القصير معقول يلعبوا بالسعر، بس بدهم يجيبوا العمله الثابته للبنك المركزي اللي هي طريقه ليسيطروا على قوتهم، قوه امريكا بالدولار. الدولار هو الدولار العمله العالميه. شو في غير شو بده يحكي بكره الحديث رح يكون في مع جمعيات تانية، هدول عم يحكوا عن مواضيع معينه، بكره عن مواضيع تانية، مشان هيك كمان رح يطلع يحكي بكره، بس بنشوف شو بده يقول. عبد الرحمن عن جد بشكرك، عم بقول انا بجرب ساعد قد ما في. خلينا نرجع نركز على
all of which, by the way, was fully paid for. So I return, Mr. Chair, to what you have said to me privately and to all of us publicly, which is what we ought to be looking for is striving for bipartisan solutions to find a path forward. And in fact, Senator Lummis and I were just talking about this yesterday when it came to housing policy. So just want to put that out there. When you and I spoke yesterday briefly, we talked about the Community Reinvestment Act, and I know that I appreciated the chair raising this point earlier in the hearing. And so, but I want to just return to that briefly. I am very glad to see it's been about a year since the Fed and the OCC and the FDIC issued the proposed rule to modernize implementation of the Community Reinvestment Act. I don't think that the proposal was perfect by any means, but it does make really important improvements to how, through the CRA, financial services organizations can serve and meet the needs of communities that are full of assets, but lack the resources to make it happen like wealthy communities can. So I think, Chair Powell, you indicated that you expect this new CRA rule to be finalized in the coming months. Is that what you indicated?
Yes, that's right.
And can you just tell us, with the departure of Dr. Brainerd, who will be spearheading the CRA efforts?
So I've asked Vice Chair Barr to be responsible for moving the project forward. Of course, it has to go to the whole board, and everyone gets a vote on that. But he'll be.
إذا فينا نعمل لايك وسبسكرايب كون ممنونكم، بتساعد القناة كثير. Thank you.
Preparedness and climate resiliency were added to the definition of community development activities that would be eligible.
ماشي مهم، هدول عم تسألوا عن وظيفة معينة مين رح ياخدها.
Of course, because low and moderate income folks and the communities that they live in often face some of the worst impacts of climate change and extreme weather events. This isn't social engineering. This is dealing with the actual costs and challenges that people experience because of climate change. So, Chair Powell, can you talk to us a little bit about how you see that change fits with the CRA's overarching objectives?
صراحة ما في تقبل، وكله حكي حاليا. ما بتلاقي الأسئلة كأنه سياسية وبدهم يحطوا شيء مثل إنه هن يبرهنوا حالهم هدول السيناتورز. ما كانت في شيء كتير مدقق. هلا سيناتور وارن هاجمته شوي لباول، ولكن ما في شيء يعني جديد كثير حاليا. الشيء اللي لفتني انه هيدا زياده الفوائد اللي نسبه زياده الفوائد 6.5% عليت بشكل مفاجئ وبشكل سريع كثير ل 63%. هذا اللي حيأثر على الاسواق كثير. بعتقد قريبا رح نشوف هبوط بالاسواق على هالاساس، لانه ما كانت الاكثريه بعدها لامبارح على 0.25%.
On some of the next steps that the Fed is going to be looking at as you evaluate the resilience of financial institutions to with respect to climate risk. There's this pilot project that just was started in January, I think it was, of this year, and I'm curious to know how you see next steps there.
أكيد الCBDC مركزية هشام
we're doing really two
وبيقدروا
things.
يراقبوها.
One is
هذا الهدف
we are
تبعهم.
doing a climate stress scenario,
Yep.
which the banks are already doing, the large banks, the 6 that we're working with. And that's really just to begin the process of understanding the risks that are associated with this over the longer term. They're already doing it. And it's something that there's a lot of learning going on around the world, actually. The other thing we're doing is providing guidance. The banks want clear guidance. They actually want one set of rules globally. The big banks that do business around the world, they're hoping that they aren't in a world where there's just different regulatory regimes everywhere they go. So we're kind of working on that as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Tillis of North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Powell, thank you for being here. In your opening statement, I was here for that. I think you touched on some of the interest rate sensitive components of GDP and non-interest rate sensitive components of GDP. I think you said that we do have a concern in the latter group, inflation expectations, labor market tightening, et cetera. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're looking at the interest rate sensitive and non-interest rate sensitive readings, and whether the Fed, what sort of Fed actions can take place to avoid a zero landing?
Sure. So on, the housing sector, of course, is intersensitive spending is the thing that they're very directly affected by our policies almost right away. And the poster child for that is housing. And so you've seen mortgage rates now go back up over 6%. You've seen housing starts come down. Activity in housing has declined as people are reluctant to get out of housing activity is slowing down. On the other hand, housing prices went up in the aggregate more than 40% since the beginning of the pandemic. So we may be seeing some price correction on that too. So that's coming along, and housing inflation, which is a big part of the CPI, a little bit smaller part of the PCE. The inflation measures we follow, or we rely on, that will be coming down because of the slowdown in the housing. I guess I would say the service sector is probably less interest sensitive than that, and that's restaurants, it's travel services, travel and leisure, it's healthcare, it's financial services, healthcare services, all those services. And that's a big part of our economy. This sector is 54%, I guess, 56% of consumer spending on non-energy and food. So it's very important, and it's softening in labor market conditions. We think our tools will work on that, but we do expect that will take time.
Thank you. I know the chairman in his opening comments mentioned a belief, I don't want to misquote him, but a belief that we have too little capital in the banking sector. Maybe true of a couple of banking institutions, but how do you feel about the current capital that our broader banking sector, irrespective of where they are in size? What concerns, if any, do you have about the capital that we see out there already?
So I supported all of the capital raising that we did.
هيدا على ويب سايت الفيدرالي البانكينج سنت دوت جوف. ما في عندهم ترجمة عربية عليه، عندهم بس ترجمة إنجليزية.
I think the new vice chair is doing what new vice chairs do, which is to take a fresh look and ask the question. Even though I think we all agree capital is strong, certainly the vice chair does. The question is it at the right level? And I think that's what happens with a new vice chair for supervision. We don't have any proposals yet, but at some point we will.
Yeah, I'm going to be meeting with the vice chair, and we'll drill down on that topic. But I do know I was over in finance committee, so I wasn't here, but I do know that several members, well, first off, we know that Vice Chair Barr is looking at a holistic review of capital requirements. I think that that's a good idea. But I have to ask a question. Do you think, does the Fed consider the bipartisan passed Senate Bill 2155, which is currently the law of the land, superior to any of the Basel requirements or any holistic review process? In other words, it is the law of the land. How does that weigh into how these reviews go?
So 2155 was I think you're talking about tailoring. So they called for tailoring, and what 2155 did is it said change may tailor to shall tailor, and it also changed the thresholds.
Yep.
But tailoring is an absolutely bedrock aspect of our bank regulatory system, and anything that we do is going to reflect what we think is appropriate tailoring between the different sizes and risks of the financial institutions that we
ما في شيء
supervise.
حكي ما في شيء
What we
مهم
were trying to
صراحة.
accomplish as a part of that, I don't expect you to respond. I know that we're coming to the end of the hearing.
قربوا
A
يخلصوا
holistic
يلا
review
خلصوا بقى.
of a financial services institution is going to reveal the fact that many of these financial institutions are very different based on the activities that they're most involved in. And those sort of holistic reviews may actually result in increasing capital requirements for two banks that look like peers, but not for another because of the inherent risk associated with their business focus. Does that make sense?
To your earlier point, though, the law, the Dodd-Frank language, and as amended, actually requires that we take those things into consideration. So
And I hope
we
that we
certainly
will.
We will.
Thank you.
Thanks, until Senator Warnock is recognized from Georgia.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my questions, I know that this committee will soon consider a new nominee to serve on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And while it has not historically been the case, it seems to me that the board should reflect the diversity of our nation, that those things are connected. Policy and representation are connected. And I hope that we will see sitting before this committee a nominee that pushes us closer towards our ideals of e pluribus unum, out of many. One, and I support Senator Menendez and others who have called for a diverse nominee, specifically the fact that we've never had a Latino person serve on the Federal Reserve Board. I think it's a huge oversight, and I hope we can move quickly in that direction. That said, my state of Georgia is in a housing crisis.
الساعة
Much
عندي
of the
هلا
country, the
صارت
Federal
4
Reserve
وجه
Bank of
الصبح.
Atlanta
من
has
الساعة 2
designated
معكم.
owning a home in Atlanta as unaffordable to the average home buyer. But this is not just a city problem. Harris County, Georgia, with a population of less than 35,000 sitting on the border of Alabama, is also rated as unaffordable. In the midst of this housing crisis, the Federal Reserve continues to raise interest rates. This makes mortgages a lot more expensive
عم
for
يصعب
families,
زيادة الفوائد عم تصعب
especially young
الحياة على
families looking to
الأمريكان
buy a house.
بالمناطق.
According to the National Association of Realtors, the share of first-time home buyers is at an all-time low, while the average age of a purchaser is at an all-time high. Chair Powell, you have said that there has been, quote, an imbalance in the housing market. But if you're a Georgia family, parents in the mid-30s, young children, and all you want is to be able to afford your first home and place and build equity to one day pass that equity on to your kids, how are the Fed's actions helping that family afford a home?
Our mandate is to provide maximum employment, use our tools to foster maximum employment and price stability. And we're using those tools really now to
هدفنا نثبت الأسعار، يعني نهاجم التضخم ونسيطر والبطالة بطريقة جيدة. حاليا عم نعمل هالشيء بالأدوات اللي عنا إياها. هيك عم بيقولوا.
If they have a floating rate mortgage, are also experiencing
جوابه نفسه على كل الأسئلة. له سنتين بيحكي.
And one of our most fundamental roles at the central bank is to keep price stability. So we have to prioritize that in what we do.
Yeah, I understand the tools and the mandate, but my concern is that we could have a cure that's worse than the disease. It doesn't do families any
هو
good
عم بيقول
if we stabilize
خوفي
housing
من يكون
prices
الدواء
while
أضرب
mortgage
من
rates
المرض، إنه عم يزيد الفوائد عم نصعب الحياة على العالم العادي، وهالشيء عم يأذي الحياة. يعني يمكن التضخم عالي أفضل من إنه نأذي العالم. هيك عم بيقول هذا الشخص.
Consider the total price of home ownership, including costs of mortgages, in executing that mandate to keep prices stable.
Housing inflation is a very important component of various inflation indexes, and the way that's calculated is the economists look at rents, and then for people who own a home, they impute a rent depending on the value of the home. So it actually does factor in, and I would say measures of new leases that are being signed and new housing prices show significant declines in inflation, not in price, but in inflation. And that will play through so that overall inflation over the course of the next 6 months or a year will decline.
التضخم راح ينخفض
If
من
we're
هلا
seeing mortgage
ل6
rates
شهور
go up,
لسنة.
yes or no, does this discourage folks who may have a low interest mortgage rate from putting their home on the market and then possibly paying double the cost on a mortgage for their new house?
It certainly could. People who are in a low mortgage, a fixed rate, low rate mortgage, I would assume many of them are not moving.
Does raising the federal interest rate change the cost of borrowing for a company hoping to develop new housing?
Yes.
Does it make it more expensive for suppliers to finance expanding production and meet supply needs?
It does.
Does it give businesses less wiggle room to
أكيد
offer higher
زيادة
wages
الفوائد
and
رح
attract
تصعب
qualified
الحياة
workers?
على بعض العالم. أكيد.
Indeed.
Yeah. So all of these actions have to be taken into account. Federal Reserve does not control housing supply, but its actions do have a massive effect on housing supply. And some of these supply effects, it seems to me, will be felt for many years, well beyond when interest rate hikes have slowed or rates have even gone down. And I know you've got a difficult job and a tough situation,
بعرف
but I
وظيفتك
just hope
صعبة.
that the Fed will think more about its actions and how they affect housing supply, even as it attempts to control housing demand. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Warnock. The last question, I believe, questioner is
آخر سؤال
Senator
وأخيرا.
Sinema is remote from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Powell, thank you for being here today. In raising interest rates last month by 25 basis points, the FOMC cited Russia's war against Ukraine as a key contributor to elevated global uncertainty. The war has serious implications for global energy and agricultural markets. And as you know, energy inflation in particular can appear in the form of higher prices of other goods and services. This feels like a substantial driver of inflation overall. And in my mind, you can't understand the global economy fully without assessing the range of
أهلا
possible
بأهل
outcomes
مصر
in
كلهم.
Ukraine. As we've also seen, the war created new supply chain problems overnight and has caused abrupt price swings in select committees. How is the FOMC assessing the economic impact of the war and the range of
كيف عم
potential outcomes
بتحددوا
in order to
تأثير
inform your
الحرب على
assessment of
التضخم
monetary policy?
وعلى سياساتكم؟
So the principal, I guess there are two things to say. One is that the principal way that the war has affected our economy is really through commodity prices, grain and particularly energy prices.
بشكرك عبد الرحمن.
That's the main thing. I think really, and those have both flattened out. Energy prices globally have settled down and they're at a higher level, and and food prices as well to some extent. So the second thing I would say is that it represents a significant risk. So the war in Ukraine, the outcome is uncertain, developments there are uncertain, and you have to think of it as a source of potential risk to the global economy and to our economy. We don't, and we look at alternative scenarios and things like that. We don't really do it from a geopolitical standpoint.
ما
but we do, of
بنتعاطى
course,
بالسياسة، ما فينا
model
نشوف الأمور اللي
scenarios
ما
where
فينا نسيطر
commodity
عليها، نحن
prices are
بنتصرف
higher
بالأدوات اللي عنا إياها للأمور
things
اللي فينا
that would
نسيطر
look
عليها.
like what could happen from Ukraine.
Thank you. At home, Arizona families are struggling to navigate this economy. Higher prices are making it more difficult to afford groceries, gas, rent, and airfare. But on the other hand, rising interest rates are crowding out investment and making it more difficult for first-time homebuyers to buy a home. Inflation has also slowed housing development to a halt in Arizona. And as you know, Chairman, housing is a major economic contributor in my state. It's also clear that more spending comes with trade-offs. And it's why tackling inflation has historically been so difficult. And yet it's more important than ever that we get it under control. There's been much debate about a soft landing, where we get inflation under control without triggering recession, versus a hard landing, where inflation comes down but triggers a painful recession. Some economists are currently saying they see no landing right now, that growth is actually accelerating, and that more aggressive actions will be needed to get inflation under control. If true, that would be problematic. What do you think about that assessment?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think if you look at the data that's been coming in since earlier this year, you have seen stronger labor market conditions,
المعلومات
higher
اللي عم
inflation,
تجينا
stronger consumer
البطالة أقل
spending,
بطالة
and
نسبة
also we
العمل
saw some of
اليد
the
العاملة
low
كتير عالية.
inflation readings from the fourth quarter of last year revised away. You take all of those, they kind of all they may be to some extent related to things like seasonal adjustments or a warm January, but nonetheless they all point in the same direction, and they do suggest that the possibility that we that ultimately would need to raise rates higher than had been expected. Of course, we have
رح نضطر نزيد الفوائد أكثر
2 or
أعلى
3
من
more
المتوقع، ما كنا
very
متوقعين.
important data releases to analyze before the time of the
بدنا
FOMC meeting.
ننتظر
Those are going to
نشوف
be very
المعلومات
important
المعطيات الجديدة اللي
in
حتجينا
the assessment we have of this
بهالشهرين ثلاثة
relatively
قبل ما
recent data. We'll be
نأكد
looking
كل الأمور.
carefully at that, and all of that will go into making
بشكرك
the
جاستي.
decision, which we have not made, but making the decision that we'll make about what to do at the March meeting.
وبعدين بنقرر
Thank
شو
you.
بدنا نعمل.
On February 23rd, the Fed, the FDIC, and the OCC released another joint statement on crypto assets and liquidity risks posed to
عم
banking
تحكي عن
organizations.
الكريبتو.
It's clear that regulators see undue risk for banks in the current environment and are taking a more conservative approach. Do you believe these risks are inherent to crypto assets and how they behave, or is some of the risks a product of the current regulatory and policy landscape for crypto assets in the U.S.?
So we're seeing really in the last close to a year now, we've seen just a remarkable set of events in the crypto space. Lots of
شفنا أحداث
companies
كتير كبيرة مؤخرا
collapsing. We've seen massive
بعالم
fraud. We've seen
الكريبتو.
all kinds of things. I think, you know, we have to be open to the idea that somewhere in there is technology that can be featured in productive innovation that makes people's lives better.
بقلبها في
However, in the
تكنولوجيا
near term, we see
مطورة.
in crypto activity lots of things that suggest that regulated financial institutions should be quite cautious, and that's in doing things in the crypto space. And that's what we've issued 3 or 4 releases to the banks along with the
ولكن لازم
OCC and the
ينتبهوا
FDIC.
للبنوك.
The Fed has. And they
كيف تعاطيهم
essentially
مع عالم
say you
الكريبتو.
really need to be careful here. You need to be careful. It's early
لازم
days with
تنتبهوا.
crypto. There isn't the appropriate regulation. We're learning lots about the risks,
عم
and they are
نتعلم عن
many of the same
المخاطر.
risks that run in other parts of the financial system, but without appropriate regulation.
Thank you, Senator Powell.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. We conclude the hearing. The Fed must make sure that workers and families are at the center of every decision it makes to strengthen our economy. We've heard a lot today about the role that Wall Street plays in our economy too. As you've said, Mr. Chair, we know that higher capital requirements make banks safer and stronger. It allows them to make investments in their workers and their communities and our economy. That's what they should be doing instead of spending billions on buybacks. I look forward, Chair Powell, to working with you to strengthen our economy. For senators who wish to submit questions for the hearing record, these questions are due 1 week from today, Tuesday, March 14th. To Chair Powell, please submit your responses to questions for the record 45 days from the day you receive them. I thank my colleagues for the very, very good attendance today. Only one member on each side was not here, one for health reasons, the other just because he's doing 12 different things. So I appreciate all that, and thanks for your testimony, your public service, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
خلصت المقابلة. بالملخص لكم يعني شو صار، شو كان الحديث، رح لخص لكم اياه بشكل سريع. كلهم كانوا عم يسألوا في كتير أمور سياسية عم يسألوا إياها، وعم يلطشوا على السياسات هي اللي بتأثر بالتضخم، مش بس زيادة الفوائد، السياسات النقدية اللي عم بتتبعها الدولة الأمريكية وخاصة البيت الأبيض في حكي سياسي كان كتير. كانوا كتير عم بيدافعوا عن إنه مش بس زيادة الفوائد رح تلجم التضخم، عم بيحاولوا يحموا حالهم لأنه هن منتخبين أكيد هول العالم اللي عم يحكوا كل السيناتورز، ولكن هذا الحديث بشكل عام. ولكن الفيدرالي ضلوا على خطه بدنا نضلنا نزيد الفوائد، لأن هالأدوات اللي عنا إياها هدف الفيدرالي بحسب الكونغرس إنه نلجم التضخم أو نثبت الأسعار، ومن ناحية تانية البطالة بأوطى نسبة بتاريخها. هلا هذا طالما هي هيك نحن فينا نزيد الفوائد لحتى نلجم التضخم. هذا الملخص العام تبعه. صار في هجوم عليه وفي إيجابية وسلبية. حكيوا عن الكريبتو إنه بعده خطر، أصول خطيرة، بيحذروا البنوك التعاطي معها، لازم يعملوا قوانين أكتر وضوح خاصة حول العملات الثابتة. الشيء اللي لفتني أنا أكتر شيء هي نسبة الزيادة. رفع الفايدة حاليا صارت مرجحة أكتر يكون رفع الفايدة 0.5%، مرجحة 66% صارت ترجيحات تكون رفع الفايدة 0.5%. هيدا الشيء ما كان متوقع قبل، يعني امبارح بالليل كانت العكس، كان 70-80% تكون الرفع 0.25 و30% يكون الرفع 0.5. هلا تغير الترجيحات على هالأساس، بدنا ننتبه. بشكركم كلكم عن جد على كل شيء. كتير عالم خجلتوني بالكومنتس اللي عملتوها. بشكركم كلكم، بتمنى تعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب، وانا بشوفكم قريبا بفيديو جديد وماركت ابديت جديد. ثانك يو.